Hello everyone, welcome to What If Ichigo Died and Got Teleported to Highschool DxD World Movie. Before we start, please go support Sugaraii for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made. There will be some mistaken character's gender, but of course Ichigo is a male. Prologue. Arkura town, normally a somewhat peaceful place where the sun was dazzling in that blue sky, however in a certain area clouds of dust and debris adorned large hectares of it, civilians from children with their parents under large pieces of concrete to a suffocating environment due to the pressure that is certain being exerted in the same area. Around all this chaos, a young man with orange hair, who had superficial cuts as well as bruises and the occasional fracture, held the corpse of two infants with a lost gaze. One of them had black hair and the other light brown hair. However, nearby, a man was prostrating himself before his eyes, contemplating the boy, and beside him, on the ground, as Angetsu soaked in blood from the infants that the orange-haired man had taken the lives of a moment ago. Wow. Isn't it funny? I think that under these circumstances it is insignificant that I continue using Kyoka Sugetsu against you, said the man, raising his Zanpakuto and making a horizontal cut towards the young man's lost eyes, finally piercing the sclera of the same, causing him to later complain of pain, causing his eyeballs to suddenly bleed. Speechless. It was to be expected. At no time did they have a chance since they raised their sword against me in the Soul Society. Every hour, every minute, every second, every step you have taken until here I have seen it coming, and yet every time we face each other, you end up on the ground writhing like a vermin, he said arrogantly, before subsequently raising his sword to the height of the precordial region of his thorax, piercing it through. In the end, it was just as Ichigo Kurosaki expected. Thank you. The man ended up pulling the sword from the boy's chest, who could only let out hoarse moans of pain as his life drained away. Despite seeing everything black, all I could think about was the atrocity I had committed moments before. I don't care anymore. And a pale hand slid across his forehead. What a pathetic king, but come on, you should at least get some sleep. Aizen had begun to leave the area. To what point will I transcend? Will it be enough to finish off the Spirit King? He wondered as he looked at the palm of his hand, closing his fist tightly while smiling. Of course it will be. HZZZZZZZZZ. He suddenly altered, giving a backwards impulse to dodge the dark blade of the young man who had taken his life a moment ago. However, at the moment he laid his gaze on that young man, he suddenly noticed the features he now possessed, the horns, as well as a complete and thin mask with sharp fangs, and where his heart and perforated lungs were supposed to be, there was nothing but an empty space. He quickly slashed against the attack, however he noticed how the creature had taken the sword in its hand, causing it to directly escape Kyoka Sugetsu's hypnosis activation. Aizen took this with annoyance. Of all the possibilities he had not been able to foresee this, he thought that his holification would only reach that of an Ajucha, and due to his surprise, he was careless. I should have cut your head off, he said, and then blocked the creature's sword, starting a sword struggle where he noticed that he was losing the advantage. From one moment to the next, the creature was being overcome in the struggle, obtaining a superficial cut in the abdomen and then being shot forward, while the creature began to charge a Zero, and in a matter of seconds before he could regain his composure, the Zero was expelled. That excessive power and speed that the Zero presented caused it to collide fully with where the dark brown-haired man was. When the cloud of dust dispersed, and Aizen could be seen with severe burns, in addition to the lack of almost the lower half of his body, this river with exultation. Wow, you exceeded my expectations. You will be a great subject for them Jyoku. With a full desire to surpass Ichigo, them Jyoku began to catalyze with this desire. The Jyoku factor is fulfilled, thus taking another step in its transcendence. But the new level in response to the Jyoku, he returned to the exchange of swords. Even so, he noticed that despite having improved exponentially, the hollow continued to increase its strength equally, so in one of the exchanges, the hollow doubled his grip on the handle, giving a feint and connected a fist to Aizen's neck, pushing him away a little to define 20 deep cuts, separating his limbs. However, Aizen's evolution allowed them to regenerate quickly. Aizen stepped aside to recite a very unstable but most versatile Hado. The crest of turbidity, seeping out. A vessel of insolent madness. Boiling, denying, numbing, flickering, obstructing sleep. The crawling princess of steel. The clay doll, ever disintegrating. United. Opposing. Filled with earth, you know your own powerlessness. Had 90 black coffin. In the blink of an eye in which not even the brutal speed of the hollow could react, it was consumed by that attack that distorted time and space. Due to the force of gravity, it prevented the creature from escaping. The attack also pulverized its bones, in addition to its vital organs, while its skin was torn towards different axes of the center of gravity. However, the regeneration began to get in the way every time its organs were crushed by the pressure. Attacking with a scream, the creature launched a Zero that destroyed the coffin and then attacked Aizen with even more intensity than before. This stunt could not react when half of his skull was pierced by the teeth of that moonless king. The Mjioku in response ignored Aizen's thoughts, granting him another metamorphosis that an array of light expelled a wave, making Ichigo move away. The strange force emitted by the hollow finally unconsciously put on guard. Aizen, taking side of his opponent, launched himself directly to attack the aforementioned. This, in the exchange of swords, began to notice that his strength was somewhat superior against the hollow, being able to subdue it for a long period of time. However, despite the wounds it provided, and seeing that Ichigo's regeneration was being worn down and surpassed. He also noticed that the hollow continued to improve exponentially with each step. Consequently, he managed to take it by the neck and prepared 6 zeros in a ring, also reciting another incantation of the HAD 90. He locked himself along with it in the black coffin so that it received the zeros fully. The hollow began to scream and struggle to free itself from the attack, but it was in vain receiving the attack together. The laws of physics do not apply in the black coffin with a new form of Aizen, causing a rupture in space and time due to the concentrations of spiritual power, as well as the zeros with great Ryatsu of Hollow and Shinigami race. This rupture began to open within the space and breadth of the coffin. Due to this, the gravity newly produced by the coffin dragged the hollow towards that space in the anomaly. Since gravity was attracted by that rupture that was focused on a certain specific point, Aizen could only see how the hollow grabbed his foot before being dragged by that rupture that already had a considerable diameter. Aizen pointed his index finger towards the hollow's head, charged a lilac zero. He took one last look at the creature's empty sockets before shooting it at point-blank range on the hollow's face. Upon receiving that attack full-on, he was pushed into the rupture, being swallowed by that fissure in space. Aizen, seeing that he could be the next to be swallowed, deactivated the coffin before being caught as well. When the breakup was over, he had disappeared along with that coffin. Aizen fell to the ground exhausted. "Ugh, it was harder than I thought," he said, exhaling, looking at the landscape that was left around. You could find several destroyed buildings, as well as corpses of different civilians under different concrete structures. Wow, it was all improvised. How unpleasant, he said, looking at the sky slowly. The palm of his hand covered the sun, while he victoriously observed his task. Well, there is still that damn king. He smiled. The pressure exerted in that strange space caused the hollow to break and recompose itself, thanks to its regeneration factor. The hollow, despite the irrationality it presented, could still feel agony due to the contraction of its body every second. In response, it did something that only hollows did when they felt they were going to die. It made the call for the rescue of the Minos. However, at that point where it was not its starting point by far, but despite this, the Hueco Mundo fissure opened in the same way, but something did not add up with it, since there was no Minos in it. The hollow approaching it as the only way out of there, it propelled itself, managing to cross that irregular hollow crack. "I'm fed up, we've been searching for hours in this big old basement," Saji shouted, annoyed at having to spend hours searching happily under his mistress's orders. "Enough, Saji, those are the president's words, and if she asked for it, we won't stop until we find it," said Momo with some annoyance upon hearing the blonde's complaint for the 7th time. "But he still doesn't tell us what that device is for," said Sajin, rubbing his head. "The president knows what she's doing, and besides, we wouldn't be here if we had won that dodgeball match against Rias," Rias said, yawning. "If you weren't weaker than that pervert, at least we wouldn't have lost by such a large margin," Tomo emphasized with a small, mocking smile at the blonde. "Okay, leave that fool alone and look what I found," Tsubasa directed towards his companions. They all approached her, seeing a door with a leaf-shaped lock. Currently they were in hell in the Citri mansion, at the request of Sona, who was talking to her parents on the phone on the 1st floor in an alcove. The reason they were there was due to a small frustration of the black-haired girl at having lost the opportunity to have her familiar. Once again her rival had won the opportunity to stand out a little. However, she had recently been reading that in some chambers of her family, there was an artifact that could keep any creature at her will as a lackey or slave. This led her to thoughts of seeing herself catch a dragon or a chimera. "What childish thoughts," she said, running her fingers over her temple. "How envious." After a few hours, Sona and Tsubaki, upon receiving Momo's message that they had found something, went down to meet up with her entourage. "So this is it," said Sona, looking at the door in front of her. Her entire entourage watched momentarily, waiting to see what her mistress would say. "Well, we're here, let's see if it's right here," she said, and then forced the door open. It wasn't especially big, just a straight hallway, in which there was a red wooden box with gold release. She opened it, observing with some emotion that the object was there. "Very well, it seems we found it," she said with a smile, to which the entire group behind her gave a sigh of satisfaction from searching so much. "And by the way, President, what is it?" said Saji with some doubt from searching so much when he saw that artifact similar to a silver triangular cylinder with sapphires on the sides. "Well, this will help us in the future," he said, omitting a specific explanation just to avoid them realizing that it was due to the relatives. HMMJ, come on president, I just want to know what you're doing, said the blonde boy with a pout. You'll know later, said Sona with a smile. Well, for now let's return to Earth, she said, starting to climb the stairs with her entourage behind her and Tsubaki at her side. After having eaten with his entourage for the hard work in searching, they proceeded to prepare to leave. Normally the mansion was empty since the parents had a meeting, there were only maids and butlers in the mansion. They were outside the mansion walking a little far from it just to admire a beautiful landscape. Later, after walking for 15 minutes, Sona turned to her entourage, giving a small smile, thanking everyone for accompanying her. Everyone was going to smile back, however they were somewhat astonished to see that the sky was beginning to crack. Everyone could not react when something crashed very close to them. This caused everyone to be shocked by the earthquake, and the lifting of earth and dust was not long in coming. What is that? Tomo shouted. Let's go, said Saji as he activated his sack gear and ran towards the place where the thing crashed. Wait, Saji. Tsubaki said, somewhat stunned, seeing how the blonde impulsively ran towards the place. Sona was still processing while looking at the sky, however she saw how that crack was slowly closing again. When she came to, she was behind her entourage who had gone ahead to observe that she had fallen, followed by Tsubaki from behind. He started to get closer but couldn't realize it as soon as Saji fell to his knees, moaning in pain, grabbing where his left arm was supposed to be along with his sack gear, but there was no arm as such, and a large amount of blood fell to the ground, slowly staining it. Everyone was perplexed to see that in front of them was a strange humanoid creature. I haven't written in a while, so if you want to correct me, you're very welcome. Well, see you later, this mother will get visitors in half a year or never. Chapter 1 Lost Strawberry. Sajin began to breathe rapidly, almost running out of breath, while expectant glances remained stupefied at the situation they found themselves in. No one could move at the moment when Sajin had fallen to the ground, clutching his shoulder in pain, while the illogical creature raised his sword, ready to end the boy's agony. However, Tomo was the first to react among all. She summoned her main weapon, which was a short katana, and with decent mobility and speed, she rushed to help the boy. However, the hollow took this as aggression and in a quick movement disappeared from everyone's sight. They gave a slight blink, and with just blinking again, the girl was impaled in the stomach by the zanpakuto of that illogical being. Tomo, they all shouted in unison, ready to attack. Later, when going head on against him, the being ended up throwing Tomo. When doing this action, deepening the wound, causing it to cut more of the entrails. This girl was thrown towards Momo, who caught her with fear and with trembling hands. The girl, seeing the irreversible state in which one of her best friends was, proceeded to release tears that fell from her cheek, not being able to process well what had just happened. The blonde's situation was not much different from where he was, giving tired sighs. Everyone saw how the creature began to charge a lightning bolt from its horns. This made everyone start to sweat cold, since the person it was pointing at was their king, that is, Sona. She had not yet come out of her trance. However, Rias stood in front of her using her inversion spell. In addition to putting up a barrier, the inversion spell only managed to redirect the attack elsewhere. However, Rias' hands ended up burned when trying to reverse the zero. Tsubasa quickly tried to rescue Ria, however the hollow made a cut at the level of her neck and cut her carotid artery before she approached Ria. Tsubaki was finally able to come out of her trance, listening to how that girl fell to the ground while letting out a painful scream, knowing that they would end up the same or in worse conditions if she stayed watching. Her only option was to get her mistress out of there with her teleportation magic. While reciting spells to put up barriers and entertain the monster, however she did not know if she should leave Momo behind. Many doubts flooded her head before she realized an obsidian T-sword was heading fully to slice her neck. Tsubaki prepared for the worst, however a water dragon ended up being a barrier between the sword and the girl's neck. The hollow turned from where that dragon had been summoned. Likewise, the hollow sending Tsubaki flying just by waving his sword and dispersing that water dragon into drops by brute force. He was ready to attack Sona, however the hollow fell on his knees due to the fatigue of each of his cells from regenerating it for hours. Sona did not know what was happening to her, but she knew it was an opportunity and created 5 water dragons, as well as solidified spears bathed in magic, ready to attack the illogical creature, causing the attack to hit full on. It seemed to have affected the hollow since through the sockets of his eyes, in addition to the holes in each part of his face, you could see blood gushing out. The effort of being crushed by the black coffin and that area where it was being fractioned by the pressure of space, in addition to every attack received by Aizen, was taking its toll, making it possible for even Sona to damage him superficially. Sona tried to charge more, but when the hollow regained his standing position in the blink of an eye, he stood in front of Sona to finish her off, but a joint barrier prevented the task. It was Momo and Tsubaki who had given all their mana to make a barrier strong enough to even repel an attack from the Great Mouse. The hollow, when he felt his sword hit the barrier, and his zanpakuto was sent back along with his arm. He became enraged and screamed, making everyone fly by the explosive spiritual pressure that it led. However, where everyone saw the end was when he exerted his pressure to put everyone left on their knees. The Hollow, since he got there, had only considered Sona as a threat, since she was the only one who could harm him. Despite how superficial the wound was, the damage Sona suffered from the pressure crushed several of her ribs, and taking in air was difficult for her, as well as staying conscious. Several scratches ran down her legs and hands where blood was escaping from them. The Hollow walked slowly. He only planned to impale his sword on the woman's head. Sona saw how he approached, fearing the worst. However, she did not notice that a light was flickering at her side. In a bag she carried there was that artifact. The Citri raised her hand covered in blood, taking the object by pure feeling. She did not even know how to activate it, however, when the Hollow was in front of her to end her suffering. She squeezed the object tightly, pointing it towards the Hollow, who did not interpret what would happen next. That artifact was used by the Citri in ancient times. They also used it to tame mythological creatures in those times to be able to fight in the war. Over time these artifacts stopped being produced since the manufacturer, one of the ancient heads of the Citri clan, died in the war at the hands of the angels, and the secret of manufacturing died with him. The angels destroyed every artifact that remained, however there were a few left in existence, which currently one was kept safe by the heirs of the Citri family. However, since there was no war, the purpose of using one again was never seen. The mechanism was simple. A demon of the Citri clan was the only one who could use this artifact by applying his own blood to it, making a blood bond as master against the subject in which it was thrown, turning it into a slave of the Citri. The criteria for this to work is that the being that is attempted to subdue, even though it has a power greater than the master, it can be subjugated as long as it is not an exaggeratedly high power. The device being in contact with the blood of the Citri caused it to activate, recognizing that the user is from the Citri house. What happened next was the formation of a drawing of a square under the feet of the Hollow. He was surprised, did not give it importance, and proceeded to take a step out of it. However, an invisible wall repelled it and electrocuted him in high voltages, as well as a loud sound resonated in the Hollow's head, causing him to grab his head while screaming. The aforementioned attempted to break the invisible box that retained him. However, every time he tried, the sound and the rays increased their intensification. This charged a zero to break the box. However, the attack was abstracted and he received it. He fell leaning on his right leg, and while he grabbed his head, little by little a symbol of the Citri family began to manifest in his right hand, and in Sona's left hand another symbol. The Citri was perplexed. She saw how that creature was being damaged. She waited for the artifact to stop while she gathered strength to stand up and flee with her two companions who were still alive. It was then that her gaze denoted panic when the artifact exploded, and she saw with fear how what was holding it disappeared little by little. She wanted to run and even shout to her friends to leave her alone and flee, but the voice simply did not come out of her mouth. Her companions tried to run to their king's position. However, they saw how the creature began to walk directly towards Sona, whose penetrating gaze into those empty sockets made her legs unresponsive, but everyone's eyes opened when the Hollow knelt down like a jester, bowing his head before his king. The illogical Hollow growled, his body not responding at all. He was ready to slice the girl in front of him, but every time he tried to generate that action, his body simply did not respond, as if it refused to do it. The Hollow felt humiliated to be bowing his head before a being inferior to him, who on the contrary for him, she should be trembling and bowing her head before him. Sona simply lost her balance, but the Hollow caught her before she fell and put her back on her balance axis. Sona was perplexed, and her mind began to reconsider, clicking her head. She remembered what she read about that artifact. Still incredulous, seeing that the Hollow would no longer be a problem, she ran to help her companions who were damaged. However, the image that she ended up seeing when the pressure of the fight left her and cleared her mind ended up breaking her. She could only shed tears and fall to the ground when she saw the state in which her entourage ended up, seeing Saji lifeless with an agonizing expression before dying. The same with Rias, Tomo and Tsubasa, who due to the loss of blood, could not rejoin even if she had a phoenix tear, she would not be able to save any of them. At this horrible scene, Sona collapsed, beginning to break down in sobs. Why did this have to happen? She thought through her tears, but there in the desolate field, Tsubaki and Momo approached to hug their king and share her pain while crying with her. The minutes passed. Sona looked into nothingness while her companions guarded the corpses with lowered gazes. However, the sound of some somewhat heavy footsteps flooded the environment. Sona looked at the cause of this disaster, angrily went to him, and slapped him while shouting, "It's all your fault. Why did you have to appear? Why? Why? Why?" she said, hitting the Hollow's body, which just remained static. "Get away." She shouted again while pushing him, causing the Hollow to take distance from her, obeying her order. The Hollow could not attack the orders. The explanation for this is because the artifact acts as a curse projected from the master towards the subjugated. This was achieved thanks to the fact that Yen left Ichigo's body and mind so damaged that it was not difficult for the artifact's mechanisms to aggravate the curse in the corrupted soul of the aforementioned monster. About an hour passed, the Citri redirected herself along with her entourage towards the mansion, while the creature followed her fully. She told him to go away and stay away, but when he passed a certain distance, he in a blink of an eye, was back at his mistress's side. It's frustrating, she thought before entering the mansion. During the battle there was no call for help, there was no one who found out directly, because the Ryatsu signature can't be felt in this world. Being inside the mansion, the butlers and maids refrained from asking questions, even when they saw the creature that accompanied the heiress, but seeing the state of the girls. The butler snapped his fingers, quickly calling the maids to prepare phoenix tears and several hot baths, while demanding 3 others to prepare the bed in different bedrooms for the 3 girls. However, she didn't know if she should do the same for that thing. Tap 2 violet eyes. Sona was hugging her pillow for who knows how long. The part where her forehead rested was soaked. The pale-skinned girl had bandages around her body. Before that, the butlers and maids begged her to use the phoenix tear on her. However, she refused and said that she prefers it to be used on her 2 friends. After long sobs, she looked away towards the front of the room, and that was when her glassy eyes crossed with that strange creature to her gaze. The pillow appeared, being thrown and crashing into the aggressive-looking skull of that illogical being. It did not react and simply stared at the girl. Sona, despite her hatred and rage for that creature, had to maintain her composure and think about what she would do from now on, and, above all, she would have to explain the lack of her entourage in the presence of that. However, she kept thinking about hiding it from her sister. She didn't want her to be forced to give up her position as heir and take away what she had achieved through her hard work throughout her life. Since she was little, so much effort put in, from studying day and night, as well as controlling her magical power, and the fact of having to plan everything to be able to break her engagement. With all this, she managed to inherit the title of the Citri. With this achievement, she could challenge her fiancé to a game of chess where she ended up victorious, thus cancelling having offspring with that demon, as her parents had planned to obtain a pure-blooded demon as heir and mutual benefits in the family. That title was very valuable to her, almost like one of the greatest achievements of her life, or perhaps the greatest. All this to end up restricted from her title, because her sister would not like to find her sister in that unfortunate state of almost losing her life. Her parents and her sister would have to remove her from her title, for fear of losing her like that, in some way try to protect her, and on the other hand, find a way to annihilate the creature. However, something about it bothered her. Don't I want to do it? She wondered, thinking clearly that it was largely her fault. She didn't have the ability to react in time and give clear orders to her entourage minimally to reduce casualties and flee, something she could clearly do with Rain at Tsubaki's teleportation magic. I was stupid and incompetent, then why? I just have to inform my family of the situation, and Tsubaki and Momo can find something better. But she turned to look at the hollow with hatred. I can use it, am I really that selfish? She said, turning her gaze towards the window, and a tear ran down her cheek. A week later. Rias was leaning back in her seat while your entourage was on the furniture waiting for the raiding game to start. However, she had an expression of frustration due to the absence of her childhood friend and rival. Since she did not show up at the academy, she had to take care of her work separately. She wanted to inform her brother about it, but due to the commitment of the same and the arrival of Riser some time ago, as well as training with his entourage, this only compromised this action. Finally, the moment was approaching. However, their battle would have to be monitored so that there would not be an illegal loophole unseen during the battle against Riser. Rias had planned to ask her friend and rival, since she was experienced in the raiding games. However, she could not find her in the human world, assuming that she had gone to hell. That was when she was thinking about what to do when the door finally opened. "Excuse me," said that person with violet eyes. Chapter 3 Chains in the Sky. "Excuse me," Sona said as she entered, followed by Tsubaki, who was behind her. "Sona," Rias said, getting up from her seat, perplexed. Unlike her entire entourage, since they were only confused, some more than others, they did not know her completely, only the fact that she was the head of the student council, and that previously and not long ago, they had a meeting in that competition to obtain the familiar. People who have had more interactions with her were her mistress Rias and her queen Akeno. The latter being a little more surprised and confused than the other members of Rias' entourage. "What happened to you?" he said, noticing how tired she looked and how her eyes were more narrowed than usual. Well, before anything, Sona couldn't finish speaking before a magic circle appeared in the room in which Gryffie would appear. "Excuse me for the inconvenience, but the raiding game is about to begin. Miss Rias, would you be so kind as to be ready as soon as possible," said the queen of her brother, and then lowered her head in reverence. "It would be better if we talk later, don't worry. I will be supporting you in the monitoring as we agreed," said the black-haired woman with glasses to finish approaching Tsubaki to be teleported to the monitoring room together. "Very well, I hope to catch up," said Rias, watching how the floor where Tsubaki and Sona were began to shine, a sign that they were retreating. "Good luck, Rias," she finally said before disappearing. Rias looked thoughtful, but then shook her head slightly, knowing that she had to focus on winning first. Tsubaki and Sona were watching the development of the battle between the two opponents, observing how the battle unfolded little by little, seeing how suddenly the balance tipped equally, sometimes in favor of Rias' clan and other times in favor of Riser's clan. It wasn't until a certain outcome on the roof of the academy where the main confrontation that would decide the outcome of the entire fight was taking place, however it didn't seem that things were going according to plan in the Gremory clan. Riser had Icy by the neck and was about to char him like a fire attack. The heat was intense, reflected in his face of anguish, but at the same time, it turned into a defiant Dada by the brown-haired boy challenging the Phoenix to do it. This made him enraged, consequently the Phoenix making the ball of fire grow. Rias on the other side knew that it was all over. Ready she jumped to stop the Phoenix from ending the life of the exhausted boy, but she didn't quite manage to stop Riser, causing some of the embers to reach the boy, leaving him more badly injured. When Rias stopped him by jumping into the Phoenix's chest claiming her surrender, he only sketched a smile. Checkmate. Sona squinted at the other side of the screen seeing the result and how the Redeed's tears began to fall to the floor while she held a brunette who was breathing heavily. "We should prepare to go to hell," Tsubaki suggested, getting up from her seat to approach her master. "I guess you're right," she said, then stood up. Brown eyes slowly opened looking at the ceiling of the room he was in. When he gained consciousness he moved from his position forward quickly and began to breathe heavily. He had completed a deal with the great red dragon, however something that distressed him was how long he had fallen asleep. It wasn't until a blonde entered his room to explain that the wedding had started about 15 minutes ago. This exalted the brown-haired man as he stood up. However he felt another presence inside the room. He directed his gaze to the side, seeing how Grafia was standing there. It seemed like she was waiting for him to wake up. "Hi do Icy," greeted him again. "I know you have questions and want to know what's going on, but it would be better if you were there as soon as possible," he said later to raise his hand to the front, showing a paper with a black symbol. "This will take you to the party. It is an invitation directly. Rias-sama's brother asked me to give it to you," he said to finish, seeing how the brown hair did not take long to take the paper, clearing his ideas completely. If not prepared for what he was about to do. "I'll be back soon," he said to Asia, and Icy disappeared in a magic circle. Graffi gave a brief glance to the girl before disappearing as well. Icy was running through the corridors while knocking down the guards little by little, approaching a large door that he sensed was the main area where Rias was with her companions. He arrived knocking on the door, knocking down some guards who were protecting it. However, when he knocked it down, what he saw in front of him surprised him. Nothing. The room was completely empty, but it was clearly there, seeing the elegant party tables with desserts and various foods, as well as the flowers that adorned the place where the bride and groom were supposed to be. What's going on? The brown-haired boy wondered, however he saw through the window a bluish-purple light that was projected around the patio, where what seemed to be a fight was reflected. That's where he located his group. The brown-haired man headed straight towards them, coming down from that floor again. When he arrived at his group sweating and breathing heavily, he asked them what was happening. His group turned towards him looking at the boy with some concern, since he hadn't woken up in a while, thinking that he himself wouldn't show up. However, Kiba answered, "Right now there is an individual battle taking place between Sona and Riser," he said with concern in his voice. "Surprising the boy, you arrived a little late," he said, lowering his head and looking at the screen again. "Some time ago." "What did you say?" said a stunned and angry Riser upon hearing Sona's words. "What's wrong? Don't you see it as something that benefits your house as well?" he said in an arrogant tone, looking at the Phoenix. Just now she declared that she was putting her hand and title on the line, as well as the Citri family's wealth, in a fight between the two of them, in exchange for the cancellation of her friend and rival's engagement. "So what do you say, Phoenix?" the girl said with a stoic look. "Wait, Sona. You can't. You shouldn't." Rias screamed in panic at sharing the same fate with her friend and staining her with her weakness. She simply turned to look at the Redeed for a moment with a carefree look before turning back to look at the Phoenix in the face. The Phoenix's thoughts were spinning. He knew of the girl's exploits in various raiding games that almost matched his own, however the offer was so tempting to have the young Citri and the Gremory would project strength and fortune for decades to his family, along with connections with important pillars, as well as two beautiful young women in his hands. However, why was the girl so confident? He thought to himself, but his immortality and arrogance as well as desire for more and his recent victory made his judgment clouded. "What do you think, Lord Surzich?" said the Phoenix, making her still look at the girl with curiosity, "and some doubt Serafel will never forgive me and may want to kill me. However, if she really can defeat him and I deny this opportunity, my sister will never forgive me," thought Lucifer. If he refused the Citri's proposal and let things continue, he would have to interfere with the laws to cancel the engagement, but nevertheless the history of his entire family would be stained, that included the trust of the people. In the same way it would give an imbalance in society, bringing too many conflicts or dishonor to Lucifer. It is my last option, and I bet I must trust her if I want to reduce the risks, he thought to himself. He hoped that the red dragon would arrive through the door, being a miracle, but in the state that was before it made it impossible. When time passed and did not arrive, he saw that it would be impossible to help his little and beloved sister. However, it was that he felt surprise when the girl in a blue dress and glasses began to speak and challenge the phoenix. Well, I grant what the Arasitri says, as I see it, an experienced rival in raiding games would be more suitable for a fight with you, Mr. Phoenix. My sister did not have her complete pieces, in addition to inexperience in the same area, but do not misunderstand me, I do not want you to take this as an excuse to cancel the engagement. However, as I see it, it was somewhat unfair, and Citri is willing to correct it to make it more even, and this would even benefit you exponentially, the red-haired man finished saying, making the blonde smile through his teeth. It seems that it is my luckiest day equals, he thought to himself. Well, when we started, finished the phoenix. Returning to the battle, they were ready for their confrontation, giving the beginning of the battle. Rias rose to the sky with his wings of fire, while Sona began to manipulate the water by means of 2 magic circles on each side of her hand. Well, do not fall so fast, I do not want to damage that beautiful face, smiled the phoenix, charging a fire attack in his hand, going in the direction of the girl with violet eyes. When he was close enough, he was hit by a cascade of water directly from the ground, which lifted him up and then was hit by a large ball of water covered in mana. This caused him to crash to the ground. The moment he got up, he felt his ankles being pierced. This because the girl had modified her water attack to a high pressure to pierce the phoenix's body. Hey blonde, I will not make it so easy for you, said the girl to form a large water dragon. The attack was directed at the blonde, who soon regenerated and with a large amount of mana, made a flaming explosion that managed to evaporate the dragon in a matter of seconds. Wow, you do have a bit of an advantage over me for specializing in water, but sooner or later you will fall. Everything has a limit, he said as he rejoined the battle. Rias was impatient before such a confrontation. She knew the consequences and regretted having dragged her friend into this. However, she could only trust her and wait for that result, where each time her hopes were reduced, knowing of that immortality that the phoenix possessed. The battle became somewhat long, however it was seen how the Citri was beginning to tire little by little, while the phoenix showed no signs of fatigue. Some spears and spikes of pressurized water impaled the blonde, who grimaced in pain, however he soon recovered from that state. Instead, the girl had some very minor burns around her body. She knew that just one hit from those flames and she was out. You know, you're being a pain in the ass and you're prolonging it more than it should be. I don't even know why you did something so stupid, but I'll really enjoy it. That includes that small and fine body of yours. As soon as everything is over about the burns, don't worry, a few tears and you'll be as good as new, he said as he ran a hand through his hair, starting to load a fire sling in his left hand and a burst in his right to finish the fight. The phoenix attacked with great speed that was slightly visible to the Citri, who managed to put a water shield under where she was by impacting that sling of compressed fire. She knew that what followed was the explosion that she would expect to try to connect with her chest or back, but what the phoenix did she did not see coming. The phoenix's right hand rose above the heads of the two, causing a massive explosion that would affect both, and even if the phoenix's body flowed throughout its being the sacred flames, that attack that it caused also affected it, leaving large burns on its face, as well as chest, and finishing calcining its arm in which it produced the explosion, exposing its bones that soon began to regenerate at great speed. Being a being of flames, his own attack did not affect it greatly, unlike the Citri, who was on the ground at a moderate distance, while large burns went down her neck, well she used due to excessive heat, and part of her lungs had been damaged by the burns, but she still remained conscious. Seeing this, Urziches felt frustration knowing the result, while Rias began to despair and cry of helplessness because of the fight's prognosis and her friend's condition. It's all over, Citri. Give up, said the phoenix, having just regenerated and recovering his mana, while a big smile turning into laughter appeared on that face. The phoenix frowned as he saw how the girl smiled slightly. You know, I was hoping to beat you with just my strategic knowledge and power. I just needed to plan a water prison, but wow, it is difficult. So Phoenix, I want you to know that it was easier for you if you let me do that spell, said the Citri, raising her torso and resting her elbows on the ground, making the blonde strange and confused by the Citri's words. What do you mean? You're already finished, shouted the phoenix. Heh, yeah, well I still need to perfect my mana. I'm still not at all like my sister, but I want to ask you something. Have you ever heard or read about familiars, phoenix? Said the girl, still confused by the phoenix's statements. Well, if you've studied the raiding games, familiars are considered an extension of the individual's body and soul, she said with a small smile. Finish it, the violet-eyed girl finished saying, and in her hand the symbol of the Citri house appeared and shone brightly. The phoenix was surprised by the strange light, but didn't notice as soon as a punch retracted his lungs, causing his pleural fluid to rush into his lungs and his ribs to pulverize as he was brutally pushed from his position, crashing into a tower-shaped concrete structure. The long orange hair moved in the wind, leaving a deafening silence. Chapter 4 Starry Moon. There was a commotion among the guests who were watching the confrontation. The shocked gazes of the spectators were not long in coming as they beheld this strange creature. "What is that?" thought Lucifer when he saw that humanoid-looking being, a demon or a fallen one. Maybe it could be a dragon, however, he knew well that it was not an angel due to such a grotesque appearance. So what? The little Citri mentioned that it was her familiar, but where did she get it from? Lucifer continued to wander in his thoughts, but he would have to resign himself to observing to have at least some idea about it. However, the others present did not have a very different thought from Lucifer's, they found such an event strange to their eyes. The surprised Riser, who was writhing in pain from that impact, began to regenerate and try to stand up. What the hell? He turned his blurred gaze towards the creature, it was then that his gaze cleared and he saw it for the first time. That thing was standing in front of the Citri heiress, maintaining a protective posture towards her. The phoenix blinked once and immediately lost sight of the hollow, however he felt something at his throat. He looked down only to find an obsidian blade embedded in his throat. As he looked up again, seeing that creature in front of him, he tried to free himself, however the being that had impaled his throat retracted his weapon to the left and ended up breaking and tearing his neck. However, the hollow did not end there, his order was clear, finish, and that is just what he would do until there was nothing left. She took the barely regenerating body of the phoenix and threw it forward a great distance, however the phoenix quickly recomposed its neck and began to fly in the sky, however the hollow began to charge a zero, and Sona was shocked by this action, remembering when her bishop tried to repel it, but she noticed for some reason that attack looked more prominent. The phoenix saw this with some fear. If I couldn't see when it attacked me, what would happen if it hit me? She thought a little helplessly, however her mind worked as quickly as it could. Wait, the girl said. It's a familiar. The phoenix shot out towards where Sona was to prevent the hollow from making its attack, but as soon as the creature saw that the phoenix was approaching its mistress, it didn't hold back any longer and threw it before it reached her. The phoenix didn't know where it got so much speed from its body, but it managed to almost dodge that attack, only losing an arm and part of its clavipectoral region. However, as the hollow, he saw that his mistress was near the crossfire and moved his head to divert the attack. The explosion was given out of range where it could not affect his mistress. However, the gaze of those who witnessed the event shuddered. This included a certain Redeed. The pocket dimension wobbled and began to break, causing the three individuals to be repelled from the same dimension, since due to the density of the spiritual energy attack it could not hold and broke, already being out of that dimension. The three individuals began to fall in the air right where everyone present was. The Citri began to plummet in the air with an expression of astonishment and nervousness, not being able to react to the situation, but the hollow caught her and placed it on his arm, as if he were carrying a pillow on his right side. This same hollow was standing in the air due to the layer of reishi that he made on his feet, however for the blonde it was not the case that he fell directly, stamping his head against the ground. However, the regeneration coming from his immortality was beginning to work. The hollow quickly lowered to the ground, leaving the girl who could not react so quickly to that action, while the hollow began to approach the blonde, who looked at him with fear. Ravel, the little sister of the same, went toward Sona with an expression of anguish and shedding tears and begged her to stop him. You win now, but please stop it. Please, said the little blonde, bowing her head as her sobs were heard throughout the room, while the guests began to sweat and tremble from the presence of the creature so close, but instead another zero did not wait with absolute willingness to completely evaporate the body of that blonde, testing if the immortality of the phoenix really reached those extremes. However, a red-haired man stood in front of the hollow. If you throw that here, many could lose their lives, said this, seeing how the hollow did not seem to care or even understand it, while the Ryatsu sphere in his horns began to grow larger, and Surzichas began to raise his hand with a serious look. However, the hollow listened to his mistress. Wait. And the zero retracted, causing the explosion to not end completely and hit both the creature and the blonde and the red-haired man. However, the hollow did not. He flinched at his own attack and stood still as he turned to look into his mistress's eyes. She simply shuddered a little at that look that reflected nothing due to the dark sockets that faced her. On the other hand, the Redeed along with the blonde had not been affected due to a barrier that Lucifer put up. However, he himself saw how his barrier cracked. Even if the creature's attack had not concluded and was insignificant to be called an explosion, it managed to fragment it, leaving the Redeed curious if he could really withstand those explosions that he saw in the projection. Hey, you've already done your job, you can go, said the girl with a trembling voice. However, the hollow only approached the girl and being in front of her caused her to become exalted, and however the hollow then only took her by the arm and lifted her from the ground, causing the girl to be a little stunned by such an abrupt action. However, the hollow only seeing his mistress standing, he dropped one knee, bowing with the other, while taking the girl's hand that contained the Citri symbol, along with his own, which like her, also appeared the same symbol, only under his head, and then began to fade in a bluish light, not without first giving a grunt. This apparently continued to bother that hollow, who despite his irrationality, seemed to have signs of pride and dignity, which by doing this action, For him it felt that the same signs that were vaguely engraved in his broken mind were spat out and crushed in his face. If we could take that skull as one. Chapter 5 Stepping on Snails. The entire room fell silent, and yet the small Citri could be heard hyperventilating due to the tiredness of the fight, but one thing was certain, summoning the creature was not a problem, but sending it back was an exception to the rule. Yes, she did not know where she was going to the hollow, but wherever she went, it was an incredible waste of mana, and her burns did not help her situation. The violet-eyed girl was about to collapse on the ground, but her friend caught her before she fell. Sona, thanks, said the Redeed, still stunned but happy about the fact that her friend and rival had won, but still with doubts about what she brought. This isn't fair, said an exalted phoenix for the results. How can you call that familiar? Said the phoenix suspiciously, looking at the Citri, making her look back at her with a tired expression and without wanting to even speak because of the exhaustion and headache she felt right now. However, she raised the back of her hand so the phoenix could see fully. If you like, I can bring it again for you to confirm it, she said without further ado, making the phoenix become exalted while sweat ran down his forehead. That won't be necessary, the result has already been decided, said a Surzich with a smile on his face, looking at Ravel and Riser, causing the aforementioned to look away. But the Redeed turned to the girl as he approached. I must thank you for helping my dear sister Miss Citri. If there is something I can offer you, ask me with pleasure. But there is something I have wanted to ask you, said the Redeed. However, the Citri rushed to speak. It is really an honor, Mr. Lucifer, but I just want to go and rest right now. As for the questions you have, I regret having to postpone them, and just as a favor, I hope you do not tell my sister what you saw, or at least that she does not find out so quickly. If it is not too much trouble, he said, getting back up, stopping, leaning on Ria's shoulder, although she knew that sooner or later her sister would find out what happened and more of what was shown in that battle. It is not every day a recognized house faces an equally recognized one while fighting with a beast of incredibly dubious origin with orange hair is a story that drunks would tell in a biased bar in the underworld. However, nothing out of the actually, that's what happened, so I knew it couldn't be hidden. Well, I'm sorry to have to say goodbye, Rias, but I don't feel very well. Wait, could you take a phoenix tear to heal yourself right now? Said the red-haired girl. However, this other one shook her head since she doesn't like to depend too much on something outside her family. It's not necessary in the land where I live. I have some that my family bought not long ago just as an emergency. Tsubaki, it's time. Sona called her queen to leave the place directly. Well, Lord Lucifer, I hope I can count on your support regarding what was discussed, said the same girl, starting to be at her queen's side. Very well, I will respect your wishes for your help, but I hope that you can clarify my doubts as soon as possible, said the Redeed somewhat reluctantly inside, but nevertheless he would have to respect her decision, even if this left him with doubts all the time. Until they met again, at least he hoped that sister would hire him when she knew something, seeing how the girls began to fade away together with a magic circle beneath them. Achao! Shouted a chestnut-haired man who was running quickly towards his president, followed behind by his comrades. I'm really sorry, said he, bowed his head. I was really too weak. I hope you can forgive me, he said with frustration while lowering his head. The others who accompanied him only limited themselves to following the chestnut-haired man's action. She could only smile at her entire entourage before speaking again. It's exhausting. The little Citri fell on the bed after previously healing her wounds with a tear. She did not recover her mental fatigue, but only the physical. She was already on the ground while she was on top of her bed. Her head was flooded with thoughts of what will happen next when her family found out about her entourage, or if she did not know whether to lie. But as she thought, each time her vision began to fade, thus falling into the hands of Morpheus. What is this? The Citri was in nowhere. However, a feeling of nostalgia took her strangely. Everything was completely dark. She did not stop looking around. There were no signs of anything. However, she began to walk aimlessly, but stopped in her tracks when she heard as if a sound of metal fell to the ground behind her. That was when she turned around, but what she saw left her speechless. In front of her was an individual whose face she could not see because a distorted shadow prevented her from seeing it. He was holding the corpses of two little girls, while a sword that she would have sworn she had seen elsewhere was presented next to that individual covered in blood. It was not indeducible that it came from those infants who were held tightly as if the individual holding them clung to them helplessly. What's going on? The young woman leaned her hand in the direction of the subject with a look that expressed confusion, but as soon as she did that, she woke up suddenly, sweating profusely. What happened? She said, taking small breaths, looking around for that subject and the infants he was carrying. That was a very strange dream for her. Chapter 6 Hollow in the chest. The young Citri was disoriented, sweating while her heart was racing. She closed her eyes, suddenly trying to calm down. When she finally managed it, she turned her gaze towards the wall, observing a clock that marked 12 p.m. Yes, I have been missing a lot of time at the academy. I am starting to be an embarrassment as the student counselor, she said to herself, starting to move to the side of the bed. She looked at her cell phone, seeing several missed calls from her friend and rival Rias. She simply got up from where she was going directly to the bathroom to take a shower. She herself looked at her reflection, observing directly the lower part of her eyelids which were slightly reddish. I hope it is a normal day. I would like you to come with me to the academy too, said the Citri to herself somewhat dully and starting to wash. The commotion flooded the academy with murmurs around the halls. This due to the return of certain people to the academy. There were multiple theories from an illness to that those same people had disappeared due to a car accident. But nevertheless a certain brown-haired man was heading towards the occult club, but nevertheless managed to hear what the people were talking about. He knew well who they were referring to, but now he knew the real reason, remembering the little girl with violet eyes. He felt helpless when she was about to lose, since it was the last option for her president to be free, but that orange hair was reflected in his mind every time he thought about what happened yesterday. When he arrived at the occult club he forgot all his thoughts as his eyes could only observe the alarming proportions of Akeno and Rias, causing his thoughts to momentarily turn him into a brainless monkey. Rias was sitting at her desk clearing her thoughts, since she had been calling her friend, but she didn't answer. She had many questions, but knew she shouldn't rush things. But some brief sounds coming from her cell phone quickly caught her attention. Hello, sorry for not answering. The truth, I was very tired and I fell asleep. Right now I have arrived at the Kuo Academy. I appreciate you being able to help me with the paperwork. If you want to talk, come to the council room. That message ended and soon she finished reading it. Rias sighed when she saw that everything was fine, but curiosity took over her shoulder. Akeno, come with me, said the Redeed looking at her queen, who returned the look with a nod. Hey, what do I do with Butchu? Said the brown-haired girl, pointing her finger at him. Don't worry Ichigo-kun, we won't be long. You better go eat and get ready for class. She said as she got up from her desk and then left with Akeno. Knock, knock. The knock against the wood of the door was heard on the other side of the student council door. Come in, said the young Citri, arranging some papers that were on her desk. Excuse me, said Rias, followed by Akeno, who, once inside, had their eyes lightly scanned the entire place like any other day they were there. Inside that room you could find Sona sitting with her attention on the sheets in her hand and Tsubaki, who was standing next to her arranging some books on a shelf. Sorry for not being able to thank you personally and send that written message for taking care of the council, Sona said, starting the conversation. I'm the one who should still thank you for it, Rias said hurriedly. It's nothing, in itself I couldn't let the marriage happen. As soon as I heard the news from Grafia to your brother that your pawn would not arrive on time, I had to interfere. Since you were children you have always been bothered by that engagement, and although I happened to hear that news by chance, I knew that no one at that moment could break the engagement unless it was your pawn who has such a powerful gear. In itself I'm glad to have heard that conversation, she said to finally give a smile, making her friend also reflect one. It seems that I am not the only one who has a servant with such power. This momentarily erased the Citri's smile, making memories of that creature massacring her friends appear in her mind for a moment. Why yes. Said the young woman, looking at her left hand where that symbol was. This didn't go unnoticed by the Redeed, who instantly added, well, another thing that has been eating away at my head for the last week and since yesterday. Where have you been and what is that thing? Said the Grimoire, changing her expression to one of doubt, seeing how the black-haired girl's gaze briefly faded, but she still looked her in the eyes. I don't even know, but I know very well that it is dangerous and aberrant, she said the last with a bit of disgust, as she remembered that skull with sharp expressions. About where I was, many things happened, and I know you have an idea, and you were right, he is the cause of him why I haven't been to the academy, she finished. For the Grimoire this did not solve any of her doubts, however she noticed how her friend evaded and reflected anguish at having mentioned that creature. For now that is all I can tell you, until I find out more about the creature, said the black-haired girl, regaining a calm expression and giving a fake smile. Very well Sona, I suppose we will have to see each other another time, said the Grimoire while giving Akeno a look to leave. She knew very well that she did not want to talk about that subject, but as soon as she was one step away from leaving through the door, the blue-eyed girl noticed something very imperceptible, and as soon as she realized, she turned her head to see the Citri and Tsubaki again, who were there. Where is your entourage? The fake smile of the violet-eyed girl spread a little more and she hurried to say. They are still in hell, do not worry, later I will tell you in more detail, she said in such a dry tone that it did not allow the Grimoire saying another word, only left there with a shower of thoughts running through his mind. This was not even very different from the idea of his queen that he had not realized until his king mentioned it. However, a Momo that they had not seen was heading towards the council, making the two girls stop thinking about it so much while they sighed. Chapter 7 Storm. Several weeks had passed, almost reaching a month since Ria's Grimoire's engagement to Riser Phonix. The rumors in hell spread like wildfire, but there were several different accounts of the story, but one detail was very clear, and that was that the little sister of the Mu Leviathan had participated in breaking that engagement, but many said that an unknown demon had helped the little Citri, and others said it was a new dragon. The words of each person and citizen grew stronger and stronger. However, in a certain mansion, a girl with violet light blue eyes. Note, in the novel and last season they are blue, but in the animation house that animated it first they make Seraphil's eyes violet, but I think I'll take the one with violet eyes, just because they are the same as Sona's equals. And you would tell me, but we don't even see Suga, and I'll tell you, well yes but sometimes I'll mention his appearance equals end of note. What she who? Said the girl with pigtails, too excited. And Surzich, why didn't you tell me, said the same one standing up from her seat. I have to go with my sister. Where is she currently? She turned to look at one of her secretaries, who got nervous by the somewhat annoyed look of her boss. Forgive me for the lack of respect, but we still have a lot of work, Miss Leviathan, said the secretary, trying to keep her from being separated from her obligations as a moo. And remember that you have your show at 3 p.m. You can't miss it, since we will once again speak with the executives who come from the other side of hell. It took us a long time to reach an agreement to directly obtain a meeting, said the same one, seeing how her boss began to take her coat while dropping several important documents. However, the latter made the mouse stop with an expression of helplessness. While she went back to her desk and dropped her coat in a small table that was next to it. Fine, but immediately connect me with Surzich, he said in an annoyed tone, causing his secretary to almost jump and rush to bring a phone. She knew that her boss was sweet and cheerful and partly childish most of the time. However, when it comes to her little sister in trouble, she usually has a more aggressive stance. Not for nothing she knew that when her parents tried to engage her boss's sister when she was little, she simply made the engagements disappear out of nowhere, and likewise, the demon involved lost all interest and became fearful. Also, all the engagement requests never reached the heads of the Citri family because she always made the requests first intercept her approval, and it was very rare for a request to escape her, and there were only 2 occasions when it escaped her, and that caused a engagement request to reach the heads of the Citri family, who accepted immediately. This caused her little sister to participate in a chess game that Sona herself proposed as an excuse that if the pure-blooded demon was not smarter than her, she would not accept the engagement. If it were not for the title that little Sona got as heir, she could not object and would get married immediately without being able to do anything about it. That day that her little sister had the chess match by her hand, her boss did not stop being upset all week, even if Sona herself had won. Finally, she brought the phone with Lucifer himself on the other end of the line. However, her boss took it and later put it to the side of her ear. Explain to me what you damn tomato with legs did, shouted the Leviathan, making her secretary scared excessively. However, the Redeed on the other end of the phone put the phone away because of the screams, giving a trembling smile. Sarah-san, it's not what you think. I can know what is the reason for your presence in these territories, said a Sona, who was drinking a cup of coffee that Tsubaki had given her before she was looking at 2 girls who had a white robe and carried holy swords on their backs. Some time ago, the Citri was walking straight to the academy, followed by Tsubaki from behind. However, her eyes met those of 2 people covered with hoods. The Citri quickly realized that they were coming from the church. She approached as she passed by the side of them. You know that it is not a place where you should be if there are many demons, don't you think? Said the Citri next to them. How direct. I expected at least that Lucifer's daughter would show up earlier, said the blue-haired girl, giving a sideways glance to the violet-eyed girl. And well that she offers them. It's not every day you see 2 girls with sacred swords at the entrance of a place full of demons, said Sona, giving a questioning look to the 2 girls who were there. Well, there are so many things. Do you prefer that we start with the sacred swords that you demons stole, or it will seem that I have already taken your attention? Said a blue-haired girl, looking directly into the eyes of the violet girl. When she heard that, her eyes opened slightly. Well, it would be better if we talked more in private. I'll wait for you right here where we met tomorrow morning, and that way we can clear up any doubts. I just ask that you don't get your ideas so hastily, the Citri finished, adding, well, I hope you keep to what you said. She concluded the talk, watching as those girls began to leave that place. Wow, it seems that tomorrow will be a somewhat busy day. The girl finished thinking about entering the academy with Tsubaki. Enough, Ichigo, run away from here and take your sisters. Don't be an idiot, old man. I can't leave you here, the boy rushed to say while his muscles tensed from the pressure he exerted on his Zanpakuto, while blood fell from the handle from the force he exerted. Idiot, just this once, I beg you, listen to me, it's not a gay mission, said while his voice trembled. They were outside the Kurosaki residence, and Karen was sweating cold and perplexed by such a situation. She could see them fully. Her brother in front of them arguing with her father was not a strange scene for her, since it had always been like that, but she could notice how the 2 of them were worried and wearing that strange clothing. However, Yuzu, who was behind her sister, was taking her shirt. She wondered what was happening. She couldn't see anything, but she was watching as her sister looked into space. Already, idiot is coming, please, I beg you, I will get him out of sight, and I will go after you, I promise, just please, protect them, Ishin said, begging Ichigo to go with his sisters. Damn, it's okay, but old man, please come back. The orange-haired man looked down, turned as fast as he could, and grabbed the 2 girls who didn't realize when they were in the air. What are you doing, idiot? What's going on? One Karen was on Ichigo's side who didn't speak to her, he just kept flying in a place far from there. On the other hand, Yuzu was paralyzed due to the altitude she was at. "I'm talking to you, what's happening?" she said while hitting the Shinigami's back. The boy was about to speak, but a blow stopped this action and sent him at full speed to crash into the ground. Before this could happen, he covered the girls with his body and used it as a mattress to prevent his sisters from suffering the damage of the impact. Ichigo wakes up. "Ni-chan, who are you talking to?" Karen and Yuzu were the first things he could see when he slightly regained consciousness. He began to get up. "Wow, Kurosaki, I never expected you to leave your father behind," said Aizen, while swinging his Zanpakuto, cleaning the blood from it. "You damn." Ichigo became enraged and quickly rushed to attack him. "Wait, Ichigo, what are you doing?" said a Karen with fear, seeing how her brother looked at her angrily. I can see how her brother got up to attack the man in front of them, but when his black sword was about to slice the guy's neck, he stopped and looked in her direction with an expression of fury as he hurriedly approaches, raising his Zanpakuto. "Wait, Ichigo, it's me, wait. He shouted without more, but nothing else came out of his mouth. When her brother had ripped out her insides with his sword, the fragile body of the infant fell to the ground in agony, shedding tears. "Ni-san. What's happening?" said the same Yuzu, crying, seeing how her sister had a large death wound in her chest and abdomen, as well as drowning in her own blood. "What the hell?" He couldn't finish speaking when he started to feel pain in his back. It took a heartbreaking turn that fell to the ground while his tears ran wildly from his face. What? His mind was working 1,000 miles an hour, but his vision blurred and he fell in a sigh into the hands of death. "Yuzu. Karen." A horrified Ichigo found himself looking at the corpse of his two sisters with his eyes open. However, images of how he executed them previously suddenly passed through his memory, causing him to vomit. The young Citri got up again, sweating. "What the hell?" she said while a hand passed through her head, grabbing it tightly. Her head hurt again, and those dreams did not stop invading her mind. However, every time she woke up she vaguely remembered what happened in them. However, another day it was going to happen again, and she would have to find out, since the routine had changed with the presence of those people with holy swords. We return to the present. "So sacred sword stolen, huh? However, you can be sure that none of my band did it. However, in these territories we have also had the presence of fallen angels. Some time ago a young man from my friend's entourage confronted someone who claimed to have taken such objectives. If I remember correctly, his name was Freed," said the Citri, having a settlement of the FPS sent from the church. She had had a previous conversation in which they explained the situation of her presence there. However, the whole conversation had concluded with the rumble of the girls' stomachs, while the serious faces of the duo went from serious to blushing quickly. As the two girls were starving, the Citri sent her Rinia for several pieces of strawberry cake and 2 glasses of chocolate milkshake from the cafeteria. Having such a plate of desserts, the two girls looked at each other for a moment. However, they quickly began to taste such a delicacy. Quickly, when they finished, the shame of having been discovered in such economic situations towards their cheeks color intensely. These, with the pure pain of the world, were designated to finish the chocolate drinks with tears in their eyes. This amused the Citri a little, and yet when they finished the two girls could only give a slight bow in the form of apologies. Somewhat embarrassed, the Citri only took some money out of a small bag, apparently a wallet that had stamps of strawberries and carrots, took out several 2,000 yen bills, and gave them to the two girls, who again were embarrassed because the girl had read them as if they were a tiny book. The two left there hurriedly with shame on their faces and headed out of the sight of the violet-eyed. The days passed very quickly, the week was almost over, but she found out what had happened through meetings she had with her Grimoire friend from time to time in her shower. She knew that they ran into the same girls and about Kiba's internal problems, but even so, the days went by, but now they were all on the outskirts, far from the academy, investigating together what had happened, and that was when they met the aforementioned Freed, who was opening his coat and showing everyone the stolen Excaliburs while chuckling. "Shijiji, you have nothing to worry about, soon you won't be alive to tell the tale," he said, smiling through his teeth as he looked up. "Don't you think so too, Kobiel-sama?" They all looked surprised as a fallen angel with 12 pairs of black wings stood high above Shez. "And to think that we would meet, don't you believe it, Grimoire Beauty, you look so similar to your stupid brother. However, don't worry, all this will end soon. You damn, that lack of respect towards my family, I will not tolerate. You are about to start a war against God, the fallen angels and the demon kings," said the Grimoire, staring at him. "Well, if that is the point, dear. If I kill you both and completely restore those weapons from the church, I think it will be enough to start what should have been finished many years ago, don't you see? And that too, huh? Sister of the Mu Lucifer and sister of the Mu Leviathan," she said to vanish from the area along with Freed. Those present, still stunned, still coming out of their stupor, were deducing where they would be currently. They knew very well that Kakabiel's power was enough to disappear the city completely. Even so, they were able to find the place where they found it, which was the Kuo Academy, where the synthesis of that holy sword was being carried out. When everyone arrived outside the academy where it seemed to be a small forest stay, they began to plan the meeting. Rias wanted to face her alone with her entourage without external help just out of pride. "This is not the time to keep a strong face, we are about to fall into a war, but I need you to warn your brother," said the little Citri looking at Rias. "This is beyond our hands, this is a high-class demon that can rival the Maus," she said, sweating slightly. "Fine, but you could also contact your sister and use that thing," Rias defended. This made the Citri briefly exalted. "I'm sorry, President, but I just called your brother to ask for reinforcements. This is not the time to want to solve things alone. I hope you can understand, however, the reinforcements will arrive in 1 hour." Akeno said, approaching, and tilted her head, causing the Riti to sigh. "Well, what's the plan?" "We will have to use a barrier to prevent Kakabiel from leaving here in case we fail," Rias said while observing the black-haired girl, who remained thoughtful for a few moments before proceeding to speak. "It won't be necessary, even if we wanted to, we couldn't." Rias clearly understood what her friend had said, seeing that only Tsubaki and Momo were in her entourage. "So you will bring him," said the Redeed, "only if things get complicated or if I see that he starts to run away. To tell the truth, I only hope that Surzich's reinforcements arrive before. Anyway, go ahead, I'll see if I can think of something else," she said, finishing so that Ria's entourage ran off in the direction of the battle, while Sona looked at her left hand somewhat thoughtfully. The battle that was fought did not have any difference, having Kiba's self-improvement later, with the presence of Kakabiel, having easily defeated Ria's entourage, in addition to Cerberus, which had been defeated by the presence of the church girls. It wasn't until there was the shocking news of the death of the biblical god, as well as the demon kings in the war and the countless casualties. The war was already won, if it weren't for the coward Azazel who decided to stop the war at the last moment. "That damn," he said with hatred. However, that news he had given moments ago had not managed to make the group and those from the church come out of their stupor, causing Asia to fall to the ground from the news. Rias wondered where her friend was along with her entourage, but an exalted Kakabiel addressed them. "You know, the thing I most longed for is to annihilate the two sisters of both Moes. This will undoubtedly leave a great mark on the history of the fallen angels," he said through gritted teeth, creating endless spears of light in the sky. But before throwing them, the angel addressed the Gremory. "But you know, I never expected you to have such a disgusting entourage, the Securite, the daughter of Araquiel." In addition to that phenomenon swordsman, this launched the attack that largely pierced the entire forest. However, the Gremory and Akeno made a shield large enough to protect everyone from the attack. When Kakabiel saw this, he prepared to charge an attack, in the form of a grayish light. "Okay, one or another shield will not make the difference, Gremory. Go, goodbye." "Who?" Kakabiel was distracted as well as those present when a great bluish light coming from the forest that a moment ago the fallen angel had destroyed began to emit that light. Kakabiel waited to see what interrupted him, but a great wave of reddish and white energy crossed the first one to his vision. He barely managed to dodge it, however part of his clothes was hit. However, shortly after he could hear a distorted roar. When he was able to observe his enemy more closely, he could finally observe where that versatile attack came from, a mask or a skeleton, the fallen angel was thinking. But his reaction time was put to the test when soon he had black claws piercing his abdomen. He opened his eyes slightly. Those present who were there knew instantly who it was when they saw such unique orange hair. They sweated cold when they saw such a creature again, while Arena and Zenovia contemplated how the creature held something that for them was a black short katana with a chain that stuck out from the handle. The beast's mouth was opened wide, and it took a huge bite out of the fallen angel's shoulder, who could only scream, "What the hell is this?" He tried to charge a spear, but the beast's fangs prevented it. They pierced his deltoid and part of the trapezius, however, right in his face. He saw a ball of energy begin to gather centimeters from his eyes. "What the buck, let me go." He began to struggle, but the arrival of a man in white armor made them separate, giving a great blow from a vertical direction, causing the two to be impaled against the ground. "What a strange creature," the subject of the armor exclaimed, taking distance from the direction where he was, while a stupefied and sore Kakabiel, who was barely conscious, spat blood. He was held by the dragon's neck. However, Voli had to react quickly when a leaf lashed out, destroying the breastplate of his armor and leaving a large superficial wound. He took distance from the monster, but it lashed out, putting pressure on the ground. Everyone in the area knelt down. However, the white dragon released the fallen angel so as not to carry extra weight in place to stand. The fallen one crashed against the ground by the force of gravity. However, the force that subdued the hollow where the dragon was stronger than in other areas where the demons and the girls of the church were. Boost. 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 "Damn it, my legs are about to break," said an Icy who could barely stand, watching how in front of him, far from there, he found how that guy with full armor similar to his when he had the Blance Bracker was barely standing, unlike his companions who are on the ground, and yet Zenovia, Arena and Kiba held their knees bent, leaning on their swords. An echo by the strength she had only managed to get to her knees because of having a smaller body unlike the others. If it weren't for the strength of Tori, she would have been crushed to death, but unlike them, Rias and Akeno were on the ground with difficulty breathing since they did not have greater physical strength. Apparently Asia was safe away from there, about 120 meters, leaning against a tree. The bearer of the white dragon, being the one who endured the most pressure, had no choice but to use one of his most powerful attacks that he had perfected to finish off his father. Half dimension, the boy exclaimed, and the entire area was reduced by half. The pressure exerted by the hollow was affected, and the hollow's abilities were also reduced by half. The hollow saw this as a threat, and at the expense of Voli's thoughts, the hollow moved in a final sound, stamping its claws against the helmet of the aforementioned Voli, which due to the blow, caused his skull to have a very superficial fracture. Due to Voli's ability to reduce the entire dimension to be able to get rid of the pressure he exerted and be able to move, he was able to diminish the capacity of the blow, because if he had not done so, his head would be separated from his body. Already fully recovering his stability from that blow, he recomposed his armor and helmet, so Voli, before the hollow could act again, pointed his hand towards it and exclaimed, "Divide division." A ray in uneven waves was directed towards the hollow. When Voli's attack culminated, he was able to bite freely due to the pressure. The ability that divide division has is to divide the opponent's powers in half and transfer them to himself. Let's take an example. Ichigo was fully at 100% of his power. What half dimension does is reduce everything to 50% in a large area, being the range 500 meters without even aiming at a target. Thus he managed to free himself from the pressure of the hollow and was able to counteract. Now divide division takes half of that power which the hollow retained. Then his capacity went from 50% to 25%, and Voli obtained 25% of the hollow's power. However, this power is temporary, capable of exercising it for 30 minutes. Voli felt an incredible power running through his body. All his senses improved, as well as speed and power. Right now he was 10 steps above the hollow. When he achieved this, he attacked the hollow, giving several punches to the abdomen of the creature. With his new acquired power, he punched again and raised him in the sky. He rushed to direct himself to him and grabbed him by the feet, sending him to the ground and making him crash. "WW, this feels incredible," said an exalted Voli watching his hands. However, it did not last long, since the hollow that was previously hidden among a curtain of dust that rose when crashing against the concrete was no longer there and was behind him. Voli managed to notice with his heightened senses and managed to block a sword with his right arm. It did not completely pierce his arm, it only broke part of his glove and superficially pierced the skin. "It won't work anymore," said the boy as he began to try to counterattack. However, something it took him by surprise, and it was the hollow's ability to defend himself. Even though he was so weakened, despite the clumsy movements with his sword due to irrationality, he showed incredible mastery with it, this due to the muscle memory that the orange-haired man's body acquired. The battle turned into a fight of combat experience, which the silver-haired boy, despite having more power, was being incredibly outclassed, obtaining different cuts from different directions unilaterally. Some claws dug near his liver, this cry of pain, but he himself was preparing a ball of concentrated magical power. Since the hollow was close enough, this released the attack, causing the hollow to be expelled with bestiality to another distance. The hollow ended up with burns and part of his organs were destroyed. Voli watched him, thought he had finally finished him off, but the next thing he saw made his eyes open. The creature began to regenerate and began to get up, causing the silver-haired man to sweat cold. "This bastard also has regeneration." He blinked slightly and lost sight of him. "When I can see him again." This one was already under him with the sword tilted, with the intention of splitting him in half. And that was the first time that I can see his eyes before those dark sockets. He began to sweat profusely. "Tsk, damn," he screamed to himself, seeing how his end was beginning to present itself. However, a scream stopped the creature again. "Enough," said an exhausted Sona who was breathing heavily and was trembling behind a tree. She had been wounded, having a somewhat deep perforation in her abdomen, caused by a spear of light coming from Kakabiel when he launched his attack of multiple spears in different directions. The order caused the hollow to stop his attack before he collided with the boy. However, the air wave hit him hard, causing him to go through a tree before falling to the ground. The hollow turned around in rage, seeing how his mistress prevented him from executing the dragon. He tried to shoot out to execute Sona, the stimuli to his body that the curse of the Citri had projected to be immobilized. Every time he revealed himself were temporarily annulled due to the division of the white dragon. However, before the blade reached the Citri's neck, the hollow struck. He screamed as the sound and lightning twisted his brain again, this being due as a last resort to the obligatory contract that the Citri exercised over the hollow as its possession. Despite the pain, the hollow resisted and hit the ground to make the Citri crash from the shock wave. She could only moan and cry slightly from the strong pain. The still stunned Hollow walked towards her ready to pierce her skull with his Zanpakuto. The Citri could only watch with tearful eyes as her end approached. Sorry for being weak mom, dad, sister, said the Citri, while everyone present could only watch helplessly. The Hollow stopped in its tracks upon hearing this. Mother. Old man. Yuzu. Karen. The Citri opened her eyes perplexed. It was the first time she heard words coming from the creature. The words themselves sounded distorted, however she saw how the creature moved away from her, as if it was afraid. The fragmented mind of the crazed being swam vaguely towards a memory that the orange-haired man fondly kept about what his mother told him in such longing times. Those were times when the orange-haired man used to smile more. Sorry for being weak. Some tears coming from the little one's face were wiped with a handkerchief by the boy's mother. He don't worry my love, I know you'll make it, you'll be as strong as your father, and that you'll protect your sisters with such strength, said the mother, giving the boy a comforting smile. This, however, still with tears, gave a more animated look upon hearing his mother's words. I swear mom. I won't lose against Itsuki again. He said enthusiastically and later took his mother's hand. So you want ice cream? Said the woman, which made the boy's eyes shine seriously. Of course. He said with a big smile to finally leave that dojo. The creature grabbed his head in pain and let out a choking scream as he pulled his mask from his empty eye sockets. He was retracting that skull as he walked away from the Citri, who looked at him with a stupefied expression. Little by little the mask was cracking as the beast began to pull harder until at one point it was broken into pieces. The mask fell into fragments on the ground, leaving an audible sound as if it were broken glass. When this happened, the young man's face was revealed to all present. You could finally see the creature's face as it gazed into hazel eyes. However, the last thing those present saw was him falling to the ground in front of the Citri. Warning. Maybe I'm worth 7 hectares of dick to you, but here I am to throw a shitload of text at you or less. Okay, I'll tell you right away that I might update on Fridays, since those are the days where I'm less busy, maybe. Now regarding caps, I don't know if they will appear in the bell of the same chapter. If that happens, and you see that it is the same chapter, do not get upset, I am simply correcting spelling or writing. Likewise regarding the previous chapter called Storm, I will be correcting things, and as for one thing I want to change is the part where Ichigo breaks his mask. I wanted to ask your opinion to those of you who recently read the Storm chapter, since for new readers, it may be corrected. In fact, I want to change this part and make it a little longer, but what do you think? Is it fine as it is, or should I expand it and change it? It's that, in fact, I feel that for readers this part is very confusing, but if you don't see a problem I'll leave it as it is. Obviously I just need you to tell me if it is fine as you see it, or if it was fast, strange, or not understandable. I also plan to change things in the prologue for new readers, as many who arrive may see poor writing or something very out of character for Bleach, and therefore abandon the story or simply don't like Sona, haha. Now if you have questions you can ask them, of course maybe I can't answer some of them, since they would be spoilers. But well, I wanted to rush Kiba's part, since it seems very boring to me. I just focused a little on the girls at the church. Likewise, if you see that I'm skipping something, it's because I don't remember this. I watched the anime 6 years ago, and I only remember it vaguely or from stories I've read. Finally, I wanted to ask if you could recommend any DxD stories, not necessarily ones that have to do with Bleach, but I haven't found any that I like, except for some that were left behind years ago, and the ones I've found always tend to hype up the main character and make him the sigma male dad that all the women want with him. For example, Naruto, Goku, Ichigo, Pepe, Tennessee entered the classroom. When they did, they got an angry look from the boys and a blush from the girls. Well, without anything else to add, see you. Chapter 8 Calm. The young orange-haired boy fell to the ground while everyone's shock was still present, but Sona could still breathe heavily. Then an upset Tsubaki ran with everything she could to help her, thus bringing Ria's group and those sent by the church out of their stupor. The long-haired girl with glasses had been in charge of putting up an illusory barrier together with Momo. This was not protective, and it had not been able to prevent anyone from entering or leaving. It seemed more like a projection, as if it were a movie. This prevented anyone from entering the fight. Likewise, she began to take out people who were there, such as teachers and janitors, as well as mothers who were passing by with their children. When she saw the alarming amount of light spears, she was extremely scared. Even a Momo almost came out with her, but the queen stopped her so that the barrier would not be disabled and immediately went out to where her king was. Likewise, a worried Momo was worried, taking charge of continuing to help people so that they would not approach if they were close to it. When Tsubaki was near her mistress, she bent down and began to recite some self-healing spells. Then Rias and Akeno arrived near her. Asia was still fainted, so they began to recite healing spells that they knew. As for those from the church, they approached the young orange-haired man. They could not feel an evil presence if it was not more like that of an angel dying and losing its purity, but nevertheless throughout the fight, they could not perceive anything. They could only feel this when they were observing enough, and when they were in front of the boy they corroborated it, but before they had an idea that he was a demon as everyone described him in mythology, since that mask that seemed to be his face had horns and was too far from any living being, except for the human. Being in front of this they observed him more closely. One of the girls tried to take a piece of that mask, but when her hand touched it, it was lightly wrapped in a blue aura and vanished into the air. This same thing happened with the other fragments. In the same way, the only thing that did not vanish was a large fragment that remained attached to the right eye of the aforementioned. This fragment still had one of the horns. They continued observing. The girl's gaze finally reached something that made them too curious. That was the chest that previously had a hole in it, but now there wasn't even one, and they could see how there were some slight elevations in his thorax, as a sign that the young man was breathing. This left them with a raised eyebrow, but a glance from Zenovia fell on that pale hand with dark claws. In her gaze was that sword that the orange-haired man used before. She remembered how he wielded it with a skill that left her slightly stunned. She crouched down to the young man's height and ran her hand through his, and with a quick movement she snatched her sword. Having the sword in her hands, she could feel that it was excessively light. She was seeing the reflection that it gave. She shook it skillfully slightly through the wind, giving different cuts trying to imitate that creature when it fought with Voli. That style of kendo that the hollow used had stunned the blue-haired girl who, since she was a child, had been trained by the church by expert masters in all types of fencing, but no expert master in kendo or fencing, as well as opponent that she had faced, had been able to demonstrate such a strange and precise fencing in her entire life. For the blue-haired girl. Of course, if you take into account that the orange-haired girl learned her own style of kendo and fencing during her transformations into Shinigami, since death was always present since he entered the spiritual world, which forced him to adapt at the cost of almost losing his life or losing it directly on many occasions. When he took a giant step in, it was in his fight with Ulquiorra. Before becoming that, he was beaten in all sense and could not even defeat it. Unlike that thing. The blue-haired girl was contemplating for a long period of time, but then turned to see the black-haired girl who was being treated and looked back at the young orange-haired boy, and Irina took her by the shoulder. "We better go back and report what happened," Irina said, causing the blue plate to drop that dark leaf with a slight scare. "Well, Irina, leave us as soon as possible," the blue-haired girl said as she and Irina left the place without saying anything. On the other hand, Rias and Akeno along with Tsubaki had almost finished healing the young Citri, who, as soon as the girls finished, she began to stand up. "Thank you very much. I am very sorry about what happened, but I do not know how to control it. When I started to approach their position to support them with my magic, I couldn't fully foresee that attack that almost killed me. I felt like I was dying and I didn't have Tsubaki around to help me, so I had to bring him here," said the Citri, looking away from the three girls and observing her slave on the ground. "Well, I'll have to contact my brother as soon as possible to deal with the current situation," said the red-haired girl with a more relaxed expression. She still wanted to help Sona, however she stood up from the place. "We better get going," she said, while her entire entourage got back up and nodded. "Og my head," Buck the orange-haired man was on the floor somewhat sleepy. His gaze was obstructed with annoyance by a somewhat dim light coming from a spotlight that had a dim light. This same object was on a wooden ceiling. In his eyes, this ceiling looked somewhat too old, since he could see planks coming off it, as well as some cobwebs on the sides. He felt his back hit the cold floor, but nevertheless his pale hand tried to block that light. Where am I?" His hand finally reached that dim light, covering it in the process, but the boy's hazel eyes ran over his pale hand. He turned it over while observing it more closely. However, the more he looked, the less it surprised him. He himself was not in the best mental condition, even though his spiritual energy had stabilized, completely recovering his damaged Shihakusho, but he didn't even feel like getting up from the ground. He was like that for about 3 hours. His eyes stared into space while his head leaned to the right without realizing or caring where he was. He even tried to contact Zangetsu when he tried to meditate, but however, in those skyscrapers where he could always give a signal from his sword and master, there was nothing but broken glass in those buildings. Not even the presence of that hateful white being was in the place or near it. When he came back to reality, his eyelids were opening and closing slightly, but nevertheless, finally taking some willpower, he proceeded to try to stand up, but not before taking his Zanpakuto that was at his side. When his vision cleared a little more while he was already standing, he could finally notice where he was. It seemed to be what his eyes showed, what was an empty basement, but around it, he could see on the ground some strange circles tinged with blue. Those circles were surrounding him, with slight curiosity, a foot as pale as his entire body, and with black claws like his hands moved forward, which made it begin to move towards one of the lines on the circumference of the circle, more specifically where the direction towards the only door from where he was there was. When he tried to take another step outside the circle, his foot was stopped by what for him was an invisible barrier. He tried to move his hands outside the circle, but the result was the same while his palm met that wall. The long-haired orange-haired man stared this same somewhat analytical thinking that it was a highly resistant glass since it was perfectly transparent. However, he decided to do what every person in that situation would have done. A fist formed in his left hand and as he squeezed it, he was directed with force towards that barrier when his hand impacted on it. That entire barrier broke into different fragments of magical residue, leaving the young man somewhat strange to see the particles of magic Reishi. When the barrier was broken he could directly see a wooden door that was several meters away from him. He took firm steps towards it and headed to see what was happening. Since he woke up he could not feel any presence of Aizen or other Shinigami. That was how the young man took the door handle while he dedicated himself to opening it. The young Citri was somewhat upset by what had happened several days ago, but right now she was preparing because she was about to go with her friend and her entourage to the meeting between factions. This was worrying her somewhat, since her sister would be there, but something abruptly pulled her out of her thoughts, and it was when she felt how one of her barriers where she had left that individual had been broken. However, Rias had entered the room where she was. "They are already here," she said, observing her friend well. "Let's hurry up and get ready as soon as possible," she said, returning the words to her friend, who only received a nod from her. "Let's go, Tsubaki," Zenovia, Momo the girl with glasses said to finish, receiving only a nod from the aforementioned, which the aforementioned continued to accompany her. Chapter 9 The Blue Strawberry. Ichigo was climbing some steps, apparently his suspicions were true, and he was now in a basement as he was still amazed by the little vision that the darkness of that place gave. He was too curious about what he would find outside. When he climbed the last step a door appeared in front of him again. He decided to open it. The moment he opened it allowed more light to enter his vision. He could observe with some surprise the place where he was. A large hallway rose in front of him. The view it gave was too elegant for him, since there were some pictures on the wall where a large blue rose was drawn, as well as several flowers in vases that were kept in small furniture attached to the wall, as well as there were large windows where the light entered. Finishing observing, he went to one of the windows. What he saw outside left him a little confused. There was a large and beautiful garden on the outskirts, and he saw many trees that blocked his vision beyond. He could notice several buildings that there was in the distance. This was still on a ground floor, but something bothered him, and it was the fact that that piece of mask got to hinder his vision very little in contrast to the other eye. It was not very significant, but he was not used to this yet. The same boy raised his hand to the height of his right eye and tried to pull the piece of mask. However, when he did this, he felt that his face was going to separate along with that fragment. Betting to feel a little pain since it was completely attached to his face. The aforementioned before the situation could only give a sigh in defeat. On the other hand, he turned his gaze towards the end of the corridor, where two large doors were at the end of it. "I guess someone saved me from Aizen. I must be somewhere in Karakura," he said out loud to himself as he headed towards the two doors. When he passed through them, he could see how the corridors began to converge and lead to different directions. The Shinigami simply sighed and began to walk through these. He came to pass a corridor where there was a large mirror. When he was in front of it, he could finally observe his appearance, which left him somewhat stunned for some time. His hand passed over his face again and his fingers over the fragment. He observed his large orange hair, as well as his pale skin. Even when he had put on his hollow mask, he had never been able to observe his appearance in great detail, since he only used it in his combat. He ran his hand over what seemed to be red fur that surrounded his neck and did the same with his wrist. "Shit, Urahara would laugh if he saw me like this," he thought to himself, starting to get back on track and try to leave the place. However, when he passed certain rooms again, he came across a large kitchen adorned with what appeared to be jade vases and other expensive items. This left the Shinigami with a flat face. "Wow. They have money," he thought, starting to approach it. He was contemplating it in great detail. However, when he came across the refrigerator, he simply opened it out of curiosity when a very tasty sight caught him. It left him somewhat thoughtful, seeing the large amount of food, from different types of meat as well as cheeses and dairy foods. All the variety could be seen in eminent quality. However, his eyes came across a large gallon of chocolate milk. This, to his gaze, seemed to be from a brand that he did not recognize very well, but by the appearance of it seemed to be very expensive. Apart from the Manteco chocolate was one of the things that he enjoyed tasting the most. He did not know when was the last time he ate one, but it seemed as if it had been a long time without putting one in his mouth. This made that when he had these thoughts made his mouth start to water, and his hand unconsciously began to move towards the gallon of milk, but before taking it, he stopped. "Wait, what the hell am I thinking? I can't take other people's things." He slammed the refrigerator door with some force. Despite everything, the boy has some dignity, but that dignity was crushed when his mouth did not stop producing saliva. This made the Shinigami start to have a war between themselves. "Take it or not, to hell, after all they had me inside a dark basement and locked up with those strange symbols," said the boy, opening the refrigerator again and taking the gallon. He already decided. He proceeded to open it and take it to his mouth. When the flow of that sweet milk began to go down his throat, he did not begin to realize that a bright blue light began to envelop him. "So Miss Citri, could you bring it?" An impassive Azazel walked towards the girl who with some nervousness received looks from everyone present. The girl also received an expectant look from her sister, who looked at her with extreme concern after having heard the previous allegations that Citri had declared. "Oh, okay, I guess I don't have to worry so much if the Mayu are present," the girl said to raise her hand, and in it a symbol of the Citri family will begin to draw, illuminating the room with a great blue glow. All the mass looked with determination and seriousness, waiting to meet that subject who appeared erratic and chaotic, but when the great glow had illuminated the room, the aforementioned began to manifest himself next to and in front of the young Citri. Everyone's gaze was expectant, even some of Rias and Sona's entourage. Sweat was present on their foreheads because of their nervousness at having them again, that creature near them, but the image that finally appeared in the minds of all those present made most of them confused, and some even began to weep when they saw such a curious scene. In front of them was an Ichigo who was raising a large gallon of chocolate milk over his mouth that he was enjoying enormously, but when he noticed all the looks his action stopped dead in its tracks as his eyes opened wide, even though one could not be seen clearly, while a blush of embarrassment appeared on his cheeks. It wasn't until a laugh was present. "Yuhahahahaja," and Azazel chuckled at such a scene, while the mass and those present were overcome with comic relief by the situation. "What the hell are you laughing at?" said an Ichigo with a vein in his forehead, throwing the gallon of milk with an indispensable force to the face of the fallen angel. It crashed, dripping something to the aforementioned, while the face of stupefaction and surprise of all those present was not long in coming. As for Sona, she had a flat face and open mouth, trying to compete against the rest of Ria's entourage and hers. As for the mass, they were equally surprised by the situation there. Not out of nowhere, aforementioned reported how a monster appreciates and threw a gallon of milk to one of the most powerful beings of the three great factions. How could it all come to this? Sona wondered, still surprised, remembering something long ago. "Do you want to become a demon?" Sona said, looking at Zenovia with a raised eyebrow. "Yes, that's right," Zenovia repeated, too sharply. "I can know the reason." Sona was with her eyebrow raised expectantly for the blue-haired girl's answer. In itself she would not reject the blue-haired girl's wish, since it was not as if she still had a large number of servants at her disposal. In itself there were only 3, and that included her, and the truth is she did not want to count on the strength of that thing, and if so she wanted it to be as little as possible. The last time she almost ended up with her skull split in two, so she would prefer to abstain from it. "I'm still thinking about it, however, after our confrontation with Kakabiel and the revelation that our Lord God was no longer there, I no longer see any purpose in continuing to fight. I am still searching for a purpose, if so I would like you to give me one," the blue-haired girl said to herself, knowing deep down that she had another reason. "Well, you won't have to worry, eventually you will find your own purpose. Demons fulfill, provoke and crave desires in general. As long as you are in my hands I am sure you will find yours. I will try to support you as your mistress in everything I can," Sona said with a smile to the blue-haired girl, who only nodded. What followed next was the reincarnation as a demon. After that, a few days past, the presence of the blue-haired girl as part of the student council was of great support, since for a long time the tasks that were presented had been difficult since they were less, and so the days continuing until the preparation of the meeting. She knew that her sister would be in that meeting and that eventually she would want answers since she had not contacted her since that raiding game. So on the other and in that meeting the presence of the little Citri was also urgently requested. She would know inside that it was because of her prescience in the Battle of Kakabiel, however, she still did not want to see her sister's face. The expected day arrived and they headed to the meeting, thus entering the group of Rias first and Sona's group a little later. When everyone was there complete without anyone missing, the Redid rushed to speak. "Allow me, gentlemen, she is my younger sister and she brought her servants. A few days ago an attack against Kakabiel arose and they had to confront it to stop it," the Redid said calmly. "That's right, you have my gratitude for that," Michael said with a kind smile. It seems one of my men caused some trouble. I apologize for that," said an Azazel, resting his head on his hand. "Well, if that's so, Rias, Sona, would you be so kind as to give details," said the Redid, to make the aforementioned begin to explain the situation of what was fought in that battle. "So, that thing managed to defeat them both," said an impassive Azazel who remained composed when the aforementioned Sona began to recount her presence in that battle. "And that was all that happened in that battle," said the Redid, finishing her story. Then the black-haired girl continued to speak. "In the name of the Citri I affirm that all the information provided was true." "Very well, that's enough," said the Redid. "Thank you very much, Rasitas," little sister Seraphil said with a smile. Consequently the two girls turned towards their group, letting the mass tell the course of the meeting. "I would like to hear the opinion of the governor of the fallen angels on the report my sister gave," Surzich said, observing Azazel, who nevertheless proceeded to speak. "No matter what I think, Kakabiel was acting on his own," he said, looking back at the Redid. "So you didn't know what he was up to?" said the Redid. I allowed him to move to know about his plans, the fool never suspected that I had also infiltrated this city, Azazel hurried to say. Don't change the subject, said the Redeed. But yes, I asked a white dragon to take care of it and subsequently froze it in the lowest levels of hell, however I also didn't suppose that one of his own would have something like that, Azazel said, giving a slight glance to the Citri, causing her to be shocked. That's not the problem is Kakabiel's motivation to act like that, he was disappointed in your command, Michael said. Lie, Kakabiel was disappointed that the war was half over, at this point I don't even have any interest in another war. So all for disappointment, Leviathan said. Don't you have people like that on your side? The fallen angel said, getting a little irritated by the demon. That's no reason, the objective of this summit is stop with the pretty words and let's sign the peace treaty, the Redeed spoke, but Azazel interrupted him. Isn't that what everyone wants? The fallen angel finished saying, receiving a look of shock from the groups of Rias and Sona, just like these two. However, I would like to have the opinions of two quite powerful entities, however there is something that has been bothering me, and I suppose it has been bothering you too, it would be better if we talked about the elephant in the room, don't you think, Miss Citri? Azazel said, the girl almost lost her balance, she knew that sooner or later the subject would be touched on, getting a look from the four mass present there. What exactly do you want to know? Sona said, sweating cold. First of all, could you bring it here? Azazel said, looking at her with great curiosity. Chapter 10 You without sin, you are like the sun. The gallon of milk had hit the fallen angel's head and he was a little surprised as the milk dripped onto his clothes. The white dragon was perplexed. Just a short while ago, that monster who left him almost dying had just thrown a dairy-based, perhaps high-calorie consumable item in the face of the governor of the fallen angels. No, he must be dreaming, and if so, it's a very bizarre dream. But when he looked again, he could only find the same scene. The same thought was shared by everyone present. Oh wow, now you're not laughing, huh? Where did that laugh go? Said an angry Ichigo yelling at the fallen angel, however he began to turn to his sides observing the entire group of demons, he still didn't realize that right there they were all supernatural beings, that laughter had taken away his null patience in so few moments, he didn't notice this detail, and proceeded to speak loudly giving looks to everyone. Hey, what? I'm on some kind of school trip with a bunch of weirdos, the boy said, looking at the young people in uniform and then at the old people in armor. However, he was the least likely to say that, considering his strange appearance and that characteristic orange hair. Wow, that effect on your head is really cool. How do you do it? Said the orange-haired boy with a cardboard face looking at the angel, while pointing at him with the claw of his index finger. Everyone's head started to get a little wet, but Michael smiled at the sudden situation. Dujum. A Surzich had come out of his stupor proceeding to speak. Hello young man, could you tell us your name? Like young, you don't even look that old to call me that, besides I should be asking the questions, I was in some kind of luxury hotel, and suddenly I find myself surrounded by several fanatics, rather answer me, who are you? Ichigo said an overturned envelope, he acted like that because he was still upset about the event that happened a moment ago, in itself he also wanted to divert from what happened before. Hey. That's no way to talk to the ruler of hell. Have more respect and lower your head when addressing him. An indignant Rias rushed to defend her brother due to the rude way he addressed him. I respect my ass, right now I owe myself an explanation, he said, raising his voice to the same level as the Redeed, making her get excited, but when he was going to speak to him again, a brunette turned to the orange-haired man angrily. Ah, how dare you talk to the president like that, damn talking carrot, shouted an icy approaching the orange-haired boy. Who are you calling carrot, stupid face? He said, several veins stood out on the Shinigami's forehead when he heard how they were messing with his characteristic hair color. Icy did not measure his words due to the lack of respect on the part of the Shinigami, if it were not for the adrenaline of hearing how his president was insulted, he would be trembling with fear, however he proceeded to say, am I talking to the only one with that horrible hair color, by any chance, didn't your mommy dye it for you? The security finished saying, being taken by the arm by a Redeed who was trying to stop him. The brown-haired man had stepped on high ground, causing the Shinigami to bury his Zamakudo in the ground and start cracking his knuckles. Why don't you come closer and find out, huh? Let's see if I can fix that stupid face of yours, said the orange-haired man, starting to head towards the brown-haired man. The aforementioned had run out of his brief anger, causing the adrenaline to leave his system. He had realized too late what he had caused, seeing how a furious Ichigo began to slowly approach his direction, while listening to how the orange-haired man's phalanges echoed loudly, being heard throughout the room. However, a Sona rushed to stop him by standing in front of the orange-haired man. Wait. We still have something to discuss, said the aforementioned, causing the orange-haired man to stop and frown his characteristic frown. Move your eyes, this doesn't concern you, said the orange-haired man, even in his lack of calm, beginning to advance directly towards the brown-haired man, not caring if he pushed her in the process. However, Durandal stopped his path, pointing at his neck. It was held by Zenovia, who still gave him a challenging look. Wait, Zenovia, said the Citri, putting her hand on Durandal so that the blue-haired woman would remove it. Akaichu, said Zenovia, giving her a confused look. I'll take care of it, said the black-haired girl, but before everything continued. A brief spasm captured the attention of everyone present. However, some did not have time to react and were frozen in time. Time stopped. Kiba said, somewhat shocked, seeing how his companions didn't react to anything. It seems so, but it does not affect those with great powers. Finally Azazel spoke, after all the commotion that had happened moments before. It seems that we were saved by our dragons, Voli said, watching as Icy's gauntlet made presence felt. This same one was held by Rias when she tried to stop it from Ichigo, making the aforementioned not be affected either. And it doesn't affect those who have sacred weapons either, said Azazel, seeing how Kiba, Zenovia and Arena were not affected by it. However, the little Citri also had not been reached by the stoppage of time, since one of her hands was placed on Durandal. Finally, everyone's gaze turned to the red-haired boy, who was frowning as his gaze scanned Zenovia's great sword. It seems that it didn't affect him either. Well, it was to be expected, thought Azazel to himself. Chapter 11. No sound. It's strange, she never thought that such an erratic creature would have a conscience of its own. However, when she saw it in that room acting so differently than what she was used to, it left her shocked, even incredibly speechless, when she saw how he addressed the great mouse with such simplicity. Despite the fact that his voice was distorted, he could communicate in some way unlike before, when not even a sentence came out of his mouth, but now that she could understand it. It seems to be a person who gets irritated easily. However, since she met that strange creature, she always wanted to find out why she couldn't feel any magic or anything similar in it. She could only describe that sensation as that of a shell, as if it were the presence of a dying angel. There was always a suffocating commotion every time the Mounsro stopped in her gaze, but now she herself was watching him, while holding Durandal as a sign for her tower to lower it. Time stopped. Thought the orange-haired man, listening to what the people were referring to. It was still not clear to him where he was. However, he would abstain and listen just to get an idea. His mind was still capturing what the subjects in front of him were. He could feel driving auras. It seemed that the strange subject with blonde and black hair had a signature that would describe him somewhat similar to a Shinigami, however, with such abysmal differences for him. A subject that would fit perfectly like an angel in his gaze had a spiritual signature similar to a Quincy, and yet he did not understand what it was. It was the Redeed. He did not find anything similar to a Shinigami or Quincy, much less the beings known as Hollow. However, his eyes rolled to the window, seeing in the distance how subjects in robes began to bombard the building where they were with various spells. It must be Gasper, said a red-haired girl, worried about one of her servants, looking at him in search of answers, since still didn't know who he was. The red-haired girl explained the situation, expressing that it was her responsibility to go save him. However, a brown-haired girl raised his voice, asking to be allowed to accompany her to protect her. It will be better if I go instead. Anyway, with my power I will be able to make my way through the whole road. I'm getting bored of doing nothing, said a silver-haired man, looking at the red-haired and brown-haired woman. Hey. The brown-haired boy exclaimed reluctantly at the comment. Don't be impatient, Voli. Why don't you go and scare them with your presence? Let them know that the white dragon is here, said an Azazel, making the dragon simply sigh and later smile and go into battle. He redirected all his armor, giving presence to his balance breaker. Well, let's not waste any more time. Be careful and Icy, take care of my sister, said a Surzich, looking at both of them in a magic circle, but not before Azazel gave some bracelets to the brown-haired man. As soon as Rias and Icy rescue Gasper, we will devise the counterattack, said the Redeed, still looking out the window. However, a somewhat orange glow approaching brown appeared in a magic circle, from which emerged a dark-skinned woman. Leaving Seraphil generally somewhat surprised by the girl's sudden presence. What are you doing here? I haven't seen you in a while, Sona's sister said, questioning her. So the descendant of the Leviathan, Catera Leviathan Surzich said. However, the aforementioned only proceeded to raise her staff. Bring chaos and destruction to this world. The Leviathan conjured, causing an explosion, which soon Azazel, Michael and Surzich created a barrier to protect those who were still frozen in time. However, the girl with glasses and the orange-haired man were not near them, a detail that escaped them, leaving an uncalmed Seraphil, who began to quickly look for her sister. When the cloud of dust dissipated, only Ichigo could be seen in front of Sona, with the handle of his sword raised. He stood between the attack, repelling it. However, Catera was of little or no interest, as her gaze was focused more on the mouse. The three great powers gathered to form a great barrier. How disgusting, said the aforementioned, looking towards the barrier made by the mouse. What do you want to achieve with this? Said a Surzich, looking at the aforementioned. Let's see, in general, I have an opinion that opposes the decision of this summit, she said, taking the floor. If God and the Demon King do not exist, then the earth must be reformed. You have to stop, Catera Seraphil said, interrupting her. Shut up, you usurped my place as head of the Leviathan clan, and you don't deign to act like one. But me. Don't worry, as soon as I rip your head off, I'll become the head of the clan again, said the same clever girl with some astonishment, charging again against the aforementioned. So your ambitions are to control the land, said Michael, observing the aforementioned. It seems that one understands, exactly. It is a world free of God and the mandate of the Demon King. I will take his place and rebuild it so that it has the laws that it truly deserves. Are you going to rebuild it under your command? Such childish phrases, Azazel said plainly. You're making fun of me, Catera said, challenging the angel emanating magic. May I, Sirzich? So you're serious, Catera? Of course, you may be the current Demon King, but you're not even close to the oldest ones, he said as he begins to rise into the sky. Wow, that's a shame, Sirzich said, and then together with Michael he remade the barrier while the fallen angel also rose. You're ignorant of the Leviathan, the monster of the apocalypse, a worthy title, Azazel said, releasing his wings. Are you ready to face me? You're just words, she said, starting the fight. I don't understand anything, Ichigo thought as he watched the two of them face each other. However, Sona, who was behind him, warned Ichigo about the sorcerers who were pointing in his direction. You, on the left, Sona said with some nervousness, seeing how magic attacks were directed towards them. The orange-haired man quickly turned around, while with just waving his Zancudo, he caused the sorcerers to be quickly shot down. Hey, Fourth Eyes, so you are the good guys or the bad guys, or were you planning to do something to Earth at that meeting? Ichigo asked, still not knowing who to support, since although he heard that whole conversation, he didn't really know how the place he was in worked. From what he understood right now, it was governed by those three races, but nevertheless he didn't know if he should oppose the recently alleged new reformer. I'll explain as soon as I can, but rest assured that we are not enemies of you or of humanity, she said with a worried expression and a little annoyed by the pronoun used by the orange-haired man, but seeing the abysmal number of sorcerers who were there, she decided to keep it to herself. The girl couldn't ignore that the orange-haired man was directly concerned about the earth, or at least would pay attention to it, not knowing exactly why he divided them into good or bad. This brought out a big doubt in her, since until recently he was just an irrational being who massacred his entire entourage and almost ended his own life. Well, I guess I'll trust her. I'll check later, just don't make me regret it. The orange-haired boy looked up again when he finished getting rid of a number of sorcerers in a shunpo, something that left the black-haired boy somewhat surprised since she knew well that he was super fast, but the coordination to finish them off quickly was very different from how he would have done it before. Surely that monster would have charged that ray and pulverized everyone. However, when the orange-haired boy finished, he was a great distance from her. The sorcerers would take a short period of time to reappear in his area. The orange-haired boy was about to go back to the black-haired girl and ask her some things, but he looked back at the curious guy when a little light that was given there by the battle caught his attention. He looked at the confrontation out of the corner of his eye, but his gaze quickly caught the fallen angel. Remembering what had happened moments ago, he was still very indignant that they made fun of him in front of many people when they had him locked in a basement. Well, it will only be to scare them and stop all this. It will also serve for those sorcerers to understand, the Shinigami thought. He knew well what he was capable of in his current state. He meditated, remembering when he was still in that basement. Thus he remembered Shinji's words when he trained as a wizard. He knew well that using a Jutsuga Tensho was not up for discussion. However, an intensified minor zero was possible, but remembering it was as if a Hiyori had slapped him with a bicycle wheel. He looked up, put his hand together and started loading a zero with his index and middle fingers. If that brat Hiyori could do it, why couldn't he? He thought. Who is he aiming at? Sona thought, seeing how that attack was mainly directed at the fallen angel. You idiot. Sona shouted. However, the attack was launched at point-blank range. When Catera was attacking very close to him, everything at her feet began to light up red, causing her to turn down. Azazel, who was previously calm and sure of how the confrontation was flowing, also looked in the direction Catera was looking. When he realized, he opened his eyes wide. SDFFFFFHHHH. Both received the attack. The attention of all the mass was directed towards the place where that attack was launched from, seeing how that young man with orange hair lowered his hand, while a very small and imperceptible smile adorned his face. Idiot. A blow to the back of his head came from the little Citri, who hit him with a vein in his forehead. The aforementioned crouched down, holding his head with a little pain. Why are you hitting me? He said reluctantly, looking at the brunette. As if because idiot, that man is an ally, she said, almost shouting. Hey, it's not my fault that they fight too close, he said, looking away, playing dumb. He could very well appear in front of the brunette and finish off the Leviathan in the blink of an eye, but he decided to opt for another method. Well, the fallen angel didn't fall to the aforementioned, besides he didn't launch the Zero with such force. This one could even be stopped by Hinata or Yamada, according to him. As for the mass and those present, they watched a strange scene in a comical way, seeing how the heiress lost control and gave a strong scolding to the orange-haired man who remained on the ground holding his head. At that moment Rias arrived along with Icy and the recently rescued Gasper and Konko, who returned in a magic circle. What's going on? They were still perplexed by the situation. But when the attack ended, everyone turned their gaze to see what state they had ended up in. However, when their gaze was redirected there, they could see the demon still wounded and an Azazel with what appears to be armor. See, it's fine. However, another blow to the head from the girl with glasses came. That orange-haired man is crazy, said a stunned Azazel, fully observing the orange-haired man. In all his time alive, no one had ever behaved with him in that way, lacking such respect, whoever it was. However, it was the first time that someone erased the smile that always accompanied him, but forgetting those thoughts, he looked again at his opponent who was still damaged by that Zero, and then he would talk to that Caird. Haha, how curious, the nickname the brown-haired man gave her. No. This doesn't end here, you're leaving with me, said the aforementioned, but before she could continue she was pierced by the fallen angel with a spear of light. Being erased on the spot. Wow, he still needs some adjustments, he said. He's returning to his normal state. However, when he was about to descend, an attack took him by surprise and made him crash to the ground. This brought a small smile to the orange-haired boy who already had several bumps on his head. You really like traitorous attacks, right? Azazel said as he rested his hand on the pavement he was now on, returning his calm smile to the aforementioned. I apologize for that, Azazel, however I already know which side to be on, he said without further ado, being observed by everyone present. Very well, I just want to know one thing, he said, rising to his height. I've been aware that there is a new group known right now as the Chaos Brigade, with one objective, which is to overthrow the three great factions, isn't that right? He said, looking at him out of the corner of his eye, causing several to listen attentively to this. But, to recruit people of that caliber like the White Dragon, you need a very powerful identity, right? Said the black-haired girl with pigtails, observing the two individuals who were still in the sky. That's awful, it's about the Dragon of Infinity Office Ouroboros, said the aforementioned. You don't have to worry so much, we weren't thinking the same thing as Catera, we have no intention of dominating such a boring world, we are just a group hungry for great power, he said, finishing it. So more power, huh? However, for someone like you, a descendant of the great King Lucifer and bearer of the White Dragon, isn't it enough? He said, leaving those present somewhat perplexed. Direct descendant of Lucifer, everyone said as they watched him display his demon wings, while his gaze focused on a certain person. I see Hyodu, he said, looking at Chestnut, don't you think fate is too cruel? What are you talking about? Said the brown-haired man, receiving a look from the aforementioned to continue speaking. Just as you hear it, I have the blood of the original Lucifer in addition to possessing the great White Dragon. You however are just a simple high school brat who was only human before, who without his glove is nothing more than a useless person. But what luck that you have obtained the Red Dragon, I don't know if we could call it luck as such. What a sad disappointment that it's somewhat funny, he said, looking at the aforementioned. Our sacred objects should be arch enemies, but the distance between our levels must be abysmal. Shut your mouth, the brown-haired boy said angrily as he gritted his teeth. How about I propose something to you? The silver-haired man spoke again. I'll turn you into an Avenger and end your parents' lives. If they die at the hands of someone like me, it would be a fitting turn in your destiny. And in your life, wouldn't you believe it? It would be much more honorable for me to kill them than for me to end up dying of old age. Wow, I like that idea. Said the White Dragon, finishing, enraging the brown-haired boy who was angrily about to attack the silver-haired boy, taking out his armor ready to fight against the silver-haired boy. The battle began with both dragons having their first encounter in another new life after millennia. The battle was becoming unreal due to the force displayed by both of them. Rias wanted to stop Icy, but her brother stopped her. If you get closer you will be pulverized by the aura they are emitting, he said, making Rias feel somewhat helpless, but nevertheless the battle continued its course, causing trails in the sky of blue and red color, and as it went on the silver-haired man continued to provoke Icy, who exponentially increased his strength since the bracelet that Azazel gave him allowed it. Damn, I still don't understand anything, thought Ichigo watching the fight. However, he was already somewhat fed up with this whole situation. What if Lucifer? What if God? What if the breasts of who knows who? Ichigo's patience, that was incredibly null, was exhausted little by little. Since he woke up he finds himself with that hollowed body, thinking that it was another work of Aizen, and yet he still did not feel the presence of this or another Shinigami. Did he already finish with the entire Sirite? But several attacks that were directed at several of the people in uniform took him out of his thoughts. I can't stand it anymore, I want answers, Ichigo said, entering the fight between the two, making a perplexed Sona once again have a poker face due to the orange hair's attitude. Oh. How interesting, the fallen angel thought, watching the orange-haired man enter the battle. Michael and Lucifer just remained silent, and Zenovia watched closely to see what the orange-haired boy would do. Idiot, just finish off the white dragon, shouted the one with glasses. That the aforementioned quickly understood what she meant, but her words that were obeyed were quickly interrupted by a brown-haired man who approached to say, "Hey damn carrot, this doesn't concern you," said an angry Ice, seeing how Ichigo had stopped an attack from Voli that was heading towards one of his friends. "What did you say, stupid?" said the orange-haired boy, while the veins returned to his forehead and his frown furrowed as much as possible. Sona, on the other hand, slammed her hand against her face when she heard how the brown-haired boy was once again messing with the hair of his, so to speak, slave. The aforementioned with a slash broke Voli's breastplate and sent him crashing to the ground. "Cudge, I had forgotten about that damned one. Partner, are you okay?" said the white dragon from Voli's wings. Voli only nodded in response, trying to stand up. However, an icy fell at his side as he was knocked down by a furious Shinigami. This left the silver-haired boy somewhat confused. Aren't they partners? He thought, but had to protect himself because he felt a change in the atmosphere. "Itsuga Tenshim!" exclaimed the orange-haired man, and a wave of dark spiritual energy invaded the eyes of both dragons. Voli quickly recomposed his armor to withstand the attack. In his eyes that was something new that he did not show that time they faced each other. The attack arrived in a matter of seconds, impacting both of them, causing their armor to be destroyed, leaving those present somewhat stunned and the two dragons in pain, defenseless. What the hell? Voli thought that attack in itself was not more versatile than that red ray he made before. However, that one was dodgeable, as long as you don't get caught by it before, but as for this new attack, I can't react in time. Well, I'll finish this, he thought, looking at the silver-haired man who launched himself at him, but his staff made the orange-haired man avoid it. Another new face, the orange-haired man thought with annoyance. "Iku," the silver-haired man said out loud, causing a smile to appear on his face. Everyone present was still stunned to see the newcomer, who was the descendant of Wukong from the Journey to the West story. "I see you need help," said the same one who began to wave his staff, pointing in duel at the orange-haired man who had a tired expression. "They've already fed me up," said the orange-haired man. First he would finish off the newcomer and then the white dragon. This one quickly positioned himself in front of the monkey. His reaction time was somewhat surprising, thanks to inheriting Sun Wukong's reflexes. But nevertheless the aforementioned made a sweep with his feet, causing him to lose his balance. He tried to get back up, but as Amakuto pierced part of his right flank of his mesogastrium, making him grimace, he hit his staff on the ground so that it would enlarge and make the orange hair retreat, who seeing this did just that and moved away slightly, but because of this action, he took distance from the orange hair, grabbing his abdomen. "Where do you get these adversaries, Voli?" the monkey descendant of Wukong said with a half smile and a loud voice, while Voli was still trying to stand up. Despite the sense of justice he handled, he quickly noticed that it would help him little or nothing against that adversary. However, the same appreciation in front of him caused his staff and his opponent's Zanpakuto to collide again. Every time their attacks collided, they moved further away from the place where everyone was present. "It will end faster than you think," said Ichigo, making the monkey surprised because his opponent's sword began to emanate a dark aura. "Itsuga Tenshim," he said between the clash of weapons, and a great explosion was present, sending the same one who had a large wound on his body, as well as lack of air and fragmentation of the skin, flying in a great direction. The opposite dimension created by the Maya meeting was still present, but the location where Monkey and the orange-haired man were was already very far from the others. "It's over." Ichigo sped off, raising his Zankunto with the intention of impaling Biku Zhfffff. The sound of skin and organs being pierced was present. The orange-haired man was perplexed by this. However, what stood between Zangetsu and Biku was what appeared to be a little girl. She had silver eyes that reflected nothing. It seemed like she was seeing a large-scale porcelain doll. He was still incredulous at the image that was there. What? The orange-haired man tried to formulate a word, trying to understand what happened. "Well," the girl said, raising her hand, flexing her pinky and ring fingers, and extending her middle, index and thumb fingers. It seemed like she was making her hand in the shape of a gun. Without saying a word, the neck as well as the jaw of the orange-haired man was burst. Even a great force of thrust of the supposed attack sent him directly to hit the ground, while the blood of the aforementioned spread over it. "Hugog, what the buck?" said the orange-haired man, thinking with his eyes wide open. The orange-haired boy was stunned by that impact, but as soon as he was injured, the regeneration of the hollow began to rebuild the damaged parts of him, which as soon as he regenerated he stood up however. Without saying anything the little girl was already in front of him, she raised her hand and made the orange-haired boy be sent flying again crashing into different structures, but before the orange-haired boy touched the ground again, she was already behind him, with just a wave of her hand. The silver-eyed girl made him be brutally crushed against the ground. But the red-haired boy, despite the pain, stood up as quickly as his body could and managed to evade the little girl who was inches away from him. In the end, Ichigo distanced himself but frankly remembered the words of that man he hated with all his being. Distance is only a factor between enemies of equal power. Between you and me, distance has no meaning. Look, I am perfectly capable of reaching your heart at any moment. Remembering this, his mind crossed over various strategies, especially remembering his encounter with Yami and Ulquiorra when they took Inoue away. He knew deep down that the being in front of him could not beat him, however the young orange-haired man was once again used against the ground, causing several of his bones to fracture. He spent a period of 7 minutes being beaten by the black-haired woman with empty eyes. How detestable was what the silver-eyed girl thought when she saw Ichigo, a presence so outside of her logic and her gaze. For her Ichigo was an anomaly just like Great Red, however for her he was a simple ant, compared to that dragon that denied and restricted access to the place where she was born. For a long time, she tried to access that place again however, when she managed to open the dimensional gap it repelled her, as if there was an immovable force that prevented her from accessing. Time passed with sighs, and she always opened the gap just to take a look at the other side trying to find peace, and so she simply sat in front of the gap for weeks, months, years, decades, looking at her home on the other side and longing to be able to return, this being simply her only goal, and longing for an existence that existed without reason as she was, but the years continued to pass, and suddenly, when she returned from investigating how to enter and failing again, she simply reopened the gap to comfort herself for such tenuous failures, but on one occasion she tried to reopen the breach, but it simply did not even manifest itself anymore. When she saw this, it was the first time in her entire desolate life that she despaired, and in many attempts she investigated for so long how to reopen the breach, just to at least sit and observe it silently, but now it was not even possible. So she embarked on an extensive search of decades, sometimes changing form to that of different individuals of great importance in history, in order to search for information, but all her efforts were in vain. The only option she had was to kill that dragon, but she knew well that this was something almost impossible. Right now she simply wanted to get rid of that itch that appeared in her head when she saw the boy. So she could get revenge in a certain way, as an example of what she always wanted to do with Great Red for millennia. The orange-haired boy continued to be beaten. There was a moment when he managed to bring a hand closer to his face. The sclera of the orange-haired boy's eyes turned dark with a yellow pupil. His mask was returning to reincorporate on his face, however he regained his calm, preventing the reformation of the same, making him incredibly slow, so as not to lose his sanity, even so already having an idea of how to evade the black-haired girl. Ichigo, with his new speed, managed to support himself on the ground and shot out in the direction of the little girl. How stupid, said the girl, raising her hand. However, when Ichigo was close to her, he slashed with his Zanpakuto above them in the air. This managed to open a garganta in the space and direction in which they were. When it was opened millimeters away from them, the black-haired girl was somewhat perplexed, trying to process what, in her eyes, was a look at her home from the other side. The last time she looked back at her home was approximately 9,000 years ago. The Shinigami, finally seeing the girl distracted, saw an opportunity and consequently managed to key her in the direction of the garganta, thus both of them ended up inside it. Silence. The Shinigami felt like the place was trying to expel him towards the gorge from where he came, but he was only pushed down. He only had one thing planned, and that was to get rid of that entity that crushed him in power. He knew that she did not know his abilities, so he only planned to enter and leave. Even if it did not work, he also planned to escape through the same garganta, leaving the girl to her fate as soon as he had the opportunity, but now he had to concentrate on that journey he made with Unohana. A journey built on Riryoku to avoid falling into nothingness. Or, so to speak, to avoid being repelled from that place. Suffocating, or at least that was what the Shinigami thought as he felt the colossal force crushing his bones, causing him to twist. However, the Riryoku cloak still remained, trying to prevent his body from collapsing. However, things were different for the black-haired girl. She had a face of stupefaction, and a feeling in her chest was present for the first time in her entire existence: bliss. Perhaps, she is finally here. Everything she longed for finally made an appearance in front of her. On the other hand, the Shinigami, despite all odds and pain, still tried to concentrate his Riryoku throughout his body to avoid being completely pulverized. After a few minutes, the aforementioned was able to begin to get up. He had already managed to lift his piece and lean on his knees. The amount of Reishi he had to use was brutal, because he used it to form the platform, in addition to freeing himself from receiving all the weight. This action caused the Rias contained within it to be spent exponentially with each second shit. The aforementioned could not hold on, and the platform broke, and both the Shinigami and the silver-eyed girl were expelled from that place. The Shinigami fell to the ground fatigued with his somewhat slow regeneration, also with ribs, vertebrae and limbs atrophied or fractured. However, a small silver-eyed girl still in her great stupor saw how that throat began to close little by little. She in a blink tried to return to it before it closed. However, when she was about to enter, that immovable force reappeared, and the last thing she saw was how that gap closed again. You. The black-haired girl quickly turned towards the direction of the orange hair, seeing a dying Ichigo, but he began to fade in a blue glow before the silver-eyed girl could even react. That orange hair did not leave his thoughts for a long time. Chapter 12. Even with sins, you are like the sun. Ugh, shit. A dejected Ichigo breathed heavily in pain as he looked at the ceiling of that basement, this time here. The orange-haired boy thought, trying to stand up while that characteristic carmine-colored fluid coming from the young man's body subtly painted the floor. It seems that Sona Citri had sent him back to his residence. His entire body was slowly regenerating, however the damage suffered was exaggerated, and eventually every effort required to force his legs and try to stand was a failure, causing him to fall to the ground again. It hurts like hell. He was still breathing heavily and felt his eyes slowly begin to close as he lost consciousness again. Stranger, at least a wide range of questions invaded the head of the black-haired girl with violet eyes, who was about to enter the main door of her house, remembering everything that happened in that battle, and as soon as she saw how that monkey with whom the orange-haired girl had fought returned from the fight grabbing his abdomen, it made her wonder where that orange-haired girl was. She only saw how that white dragon and the monkey withdrew from the fight, while an Icy was defeated on the ground, but she knew well that something happened to her apparently slave. It was impossible in her eyes that he had been defeated by the monkey, when at the beginning of the battle, the orange-haired man showed superiority in all aspects before him. The moment the monkey and the white dragon disappeared from her sight, she quickly activated her binding symbol and did what she always did when it came to sending the orange-haired man to the only improvised place she could think of, not knowing his condition well. However, bringing it is easy, returning it to a specific point is the difficult part. If it weren't for the fact that she was used to this, she would fall to her knees due to the repeated brutal drain on her mana. Instead, all those present at that battle at the time it all ended, a peace treaty was finally signed. However, the doubt of the Maos themselves was incredibly more and more prominent towards the violet-eyed. Even one of the Maos looked with uncertainty at her little sister. After witnessing what happened, knowing that someone stronger than a person who possesses a Longinus was at the mercy of her sister, and not just any Longinus, but one of the two themselves who are capable of reaching and surpassing the Maos and gods themselves. What should I do? Seraphil wondered, looking sideways at her little sister, who upon noticing her gaze, simply looked away. Seraphil herself still didn't understand where her sister got something like that from. It seems we still need explanations, said a fervent Azazel, giving a questioning look towards the black-haired woman, and everyone present also directed a look at her, waiting for words from her. I would love to tell you with great pleasure, and however I have to ask you to excuse me, however I still have to clarify some things. I know beforehand that it will sound repetitive, and even for you Mr. Sitsich, but as soon as I finish understanding everything, I will know it to you detail by detail, even if we have to call a meeting for it, said the violet-eyed woman, tilting her head a little, which subsequently drew a sigh from everyone present. This enigma would be postponed again. They continued to discuss a couple more things. Sigh, the violet-eyed woman let out the same while standing in front of the entrance to that basement. She took some saliva and dedicated herself to opening the door, and that was where a great darkness invaded her gaze. Later, when her demonic senses began to sharpen, she saw the vision inside it perfectly. Each step under that basement was strangely somewhat suffocating for the aforementioned, who upon reaching the last step, found another door in front of her, on the other side of which would be that orange hair. He was always strange to her, an eminence without presence, neither angel, nor demon, fallen or yokai and even human, so strange was that subject who presented himself. The first impression that he gave her when she could feel emotions coming from him for the first time, took her out of her balance a bit. She quickly being in contact with him, was able to establish a quite strange relationship, even for her to dare to reprimand and scold a being that exceeded her in everything. However, when her hand came closer to being in contact with the door handle, the questions that flooded her became greater. However, even after going around in circles, one feeling never left her, and it was the one she felt at the moment of losing many of her loved ones at the hands of that orange-haired man. Finally, she opened the door with a little determination, and her eyes finally collided with the orange-haired man, who was leaning on the floor in the wall. She could see how he was conscious, but she could see how his chest inflated and deflated as a result of his rapid and slow breaths. The young man's hazel eyes finally intercepted the violet-eyed one. That was the first thing the black-haired girl heard coming from the orange-haired boy in that basement. Well, it's confusing. I guess you brought me here again. To tell the truth, this place even seems comfortable now, said the orange-haired man, fully observing the black-haired woman. Is that so? In any case, I'm glad you were able to help us in that fight, but I'm here to work things out with you, the black-haired girl said, observing the orange-haired man as he did now. That's it. He replied to the violet-eyed girl. Well, let's go back a bit. First of all, I would like to know your name. She emphasized that even with everything about the aforementioned, she didn't even know the name of that boy. Ichigo Kurosaki, he said without further ado, making those words reach the aforementioned girl. Strawberry. The woman thought, breaking down that name, remembering its kanji. Normally it was used to call girls, but if you put it in perspective, the wordplay could also work like the number 15 or likewise the one who protects, but the latter was even more wrong and had to be entered into specifications. Even so, to the ear, when hearing this, any everyday person would quickly understand that it is a feminine character, or so to speak, that somewhat sweet fruit. Well, I still don't know your name, said the orange-haired man, staring at the woman, since the room had fallen into a small silence as soon as he had said his name. Smna Citri, she was taken out of her thoughts and approached to say this, finally reaching a breakthrough at the moment when both understood each other's name. Chapter 13, Mirror Without Reflection. Well, I listened to you, the orange-haired man said, still leaning against the wall on the floor. The violet-eyed girl narrowed her eyes due to the orange-haired man's attitude, but before speaking she took a breath and a small sigh came after. Well, Ichigo, you will know well beforehand that I am not human in general. I think you heard most of it in that meeting. However, I have to make it clear to you that yes, I am a demon, she said, looking at him while taking a pause. Anything specific you want to know? She said, causing the same boy to run a hand down his neck. Yes, well, I want to know where I am now, and don't get me wrong, I know we are on Earth now, but which part, he said, staring at it. Right now we are in Japan, more specifically in the city of Kuo. The orange-haired man did not seem surprised by what the girl said. It could simply be another city where he is now, but being the first time he saw those beings, it still kept him with the uncertainty of their whereabouts, and he approached to ask the following question. Okay, could you tell me how far we are from Karakura town, he said with some hope that his suspicions were not real. The violet-eyed girl's mind worked quickly, however this made her raise an eyebrow. She knew everything well, state, region and place in the country, even other countries, and she would even dare to say an entire continent, but even if she thought about it, she couldn't find that place he was talking about. Sorry, are you sure we're talking about the same country? He said, raising an eyebrow. The aforementioned man sighed deeply as his brow furrowed with some uncertainty and anger. Well, I don't think I need any more answers, he said, making the girl get excited. She thought it would take several hours, but it seems that just by saying that, the boy's mood was under control, and she could notice how he adopted an annoyed expression and then became dull. Feel free to ask, he finally said as he looked at the wall. What are you? She said, but a silence filled the air, making the girl feel like she was waiting for an eternity to come. Finally, that one hazel eye that was visible turned towards her. Shinigami, he said to the air, making the girl's expression grow. God of death. The girl's mind was working 1,000 miles an hour. For her, what he said wasn't so far-fetched. He certainly made a good impression with that skull he possessed at their first encounter and that tremendous strength he had, which led to another question. I won't question you if that's true, I can try to believe it for all those times I saw you, she said, but the words all those times I saw you didn't leave this one's mind for a moment, all of them. But we just met not long ago, he tried to remember a little, but as soon as he tried he grabbed his head with one hand in some pain. Every time? But I barely know you, said the orange-haired man, frowning as he slowly removed his hand from her head. Oh, that's right, I was going to mention it to you eventually, but I almost forgot. The girl raised her left hand, showing how a blue symbol was formed on it. Her hazel eyes turned towards her own right hand when she saw how another identical symbol appeared on her hand. You are now my slave, she said, making the orange-haired boy frown strongly. What, he said, starting to get up suddenly. Are you kidding me, he said, raising an eyebrow, observing how the aforementioned woman's expression didn't change. Sit down, her hand glowed just like his and her feet wobbled, causing her to lie down on the floor. HJJJ, the aforementioned gritted his teeth and tried to stand up, but his feet didn't respond. Sona withdrew the order. She only had to think this and apply mana to the symbol. When she withdrew the order, Ichigo hurriedly stood up and took her by the shirt over her neck, pulling it a little towards him. The Citri just looked at him with a stoic face. How dare you, I was wrong about you. He tried to pull a little more out of anger, but his body didn't respond. If he tried to do something painful to her, even if it was only so small, he wouldn't be able to do it. The moment he understood that he was subdued, he thought that they would force him to do it. It quickly crossed his mind that they would make him kill innocent people. At that moment he wasn't feeling well mentally, all his feelings came together and he was about to explode. Damn lying brat, well it was to be expected if you came to name yourself after a demon. I can't believe I agreed to support that whole gang of lunatics, so you put me on a leash against my will out of nowhere, lock me in a bubble, and take me out when you need to be bailed out of a jam, eh? For that you must be bucking incompetent, and all your people can't be very different from you. Slap. The room was enveloped in a quick short sound as the girl slapped him. Looks like I hit the target, he said, turning his head from its position to look the black-haired girl in the eyes. However, when he saw her, he could see tears flowing from them. You think I wanted this? When the hell did you think I chose this? You came out of nowhere and killed my friends. I can't sleep at night since you arrived. Even so, I've done my best not to break down in front of my sister and the nobility I have left. But you had to show up. Of all the misfortunes I've had in my life, you're the worst. She said between sobs, unable to maintain her composure. Ichigo's eyes were wide open in surprise and doubt, and unreasonable guilt that he didn't know where it came from squeezed his chest as he saw the black-haired girl crying frantically. Me what? Chapter 14. Your smile makes me sick. Eh? Ichigo stepped back a little at such a comment while keeping his expression fully highlighted. The black-haired girl approached him, causing him to step back a little further. Her glassy eyes and flushed cheeks glared at him disapprovingly. She quickly ran up the stairs, her sobs echoing loudly in his ears. The sad sounds faded the farther she walked. Ichigo lay on the ground while holding his head with one hand. I'm an idiot, he thought guiltily for having made a girl cry since he had expressed himself too hastily. He looked where the girl went and thinking again he decided to follow her. Now he just wanted to apologize. The sound of the wooden steps echoed as he put his weight on them with each step, his thoughts wondering how to apologize to her. He reached the other side of the door and began to open it, clearly recognizing the scene he was in, beginning to take a step back from the hallways, concentrating on trying to find the girl. By finally capturing her signature, I can tell that the girl was on the third floor of the mansion. He simply sighed and headed straight there. Knock knock knock. It was heard on the other side of the door. The Citri was simply in her bed being covered by her sheet while she rested her arms on her knees in addition to her head while she continued to shed several tears. She didn't respond, and the orange-haired man knew instantly that she wasn't going to open the door. He simply took the doorknob and opened it, making his field of vision focus on that place, only seeing darkness. But he could still clearly see that the dim moonlight was illuminating the black-haired girl who was curled up in a ball crying. Ichigo entered the room watching as the black-haired girl ignored him. His eyes tried to find the light button, but they didn't find anything similar. However, he could see a lamp making him pull it, and a large and at the same time small light managed to clarify his vision more. Finally, the black-haired girl deigned to look at him for this action, but as soon as her gaze turned to him, she could see how Ichigo had leaned forward 90 degrees while lowering his head. I'm sorry. He said, somewhat embarrassed since in his entire life, he had never given such an apology. The black-haired girl stared at him for a moment while she tried to finish wiping the moisture from her eyes with the sheet. To tell the truth, she didn't expect him to come directly to apologize to her. This took her out a bit of her stupor and the mess she was in. She wanted to vent in a good way, and in that conversation with the orange-haired man, she simply let out what she had been holding back since her first meeting with him. She tried to recover her serene and serious expression, but simply because of sadness she couldn't do it. The silence invaded the room again as soon as he declared those words. Seeing that there was no response, he simply tried to get closer, being almost in front of her bed, but still he tried to get closer. However, even with his enhanced senses sharpened as well as refined, he could not notice some silk towels that were on the floor soaked. He tried to advance towards her, but stepped on one of the towels wet from the girl's tears and slipped forward, colliding with her on the bed, knocking her down slightly. This action took her by surprise, causing her to forget her melancholy for a short period of time, feeling how her somewhat developed chest collided with his defined pectoral, making her blush slightly. Hey. She complained, seeing how the Shinigami suddenly got up, still upset. Excuse me, but how do you leave these things here? He said quickly, grabbing a towel from the floor, somewhat embarrassed by what had happened before and showing it to her, trying to avoid this accident. And well, who told you could come in? She replied, somewhat annoyed, causing the red-haired girl to frown slightly at the Citri's somewhat aggressive comment. I'm sorry, Miss Shitori, but your whining didn't leave me alone, he said, making the girl slightly annoyed. Oh? Maybe it's also because you have that stupid orange hair that makes you unable to be at peace. Maybe it doesn't let you think clearly, and you don't understand that I don't want to see you, she said, making the orange-haired boy's vein appear slightly. And I came in a good way to apologize, and this is how you receive me, he said, contrasting his outburst of words. Do what you want. She got up again, covered by the sheet, while dragging her along the floor, heading out of her room. "Hey, we're not done yet, Four Eyes," he said as he began to redirect towards her, however his foot again felt something wet as he looked at the ground quickly, barely perceptible due to the darkness that blocked his vision. Oh shit, he thought, slipping again and falling to the ground this time. Chapter 15 Orchid of the Sense. Sona was walking through the hallways of her house. Not long ago she had abandoned Carrot in that room with his tantrums. She was feeling a bit thirsty, so she would go and get a glass of water. She wanted to simply get her thoughts away and try to reformulate what she would do from now on. However, Ichigo's thoughts were somewhat different. He simply got up from the ground, somewhat annoyed at having tripped again. Whatever, he thought as he stood up again and headed towards the window to leave the place. It was night, so he wanted to take a closer look at the place where he was. A young orange-haired boy was jumping over the houses while propelling himself through the air. He could see through the streets and the lighting, children returning from their homes, as well as people returning from their jobs. The light of the city beautifully illuminated the night. He stood on a building, while he sat on the edge of it, letting his feet fall in the air. He looked down at him, watching cars pass one after another. His eyes fell upon his pale feet with those black claws. This plunged him back into his thoughts. I wonder if they're okay. He remembered all his friends from Arkura, as well as a certain dark brown-haired boy, making him feel a little bitter. He looked at his pale hand again, noticing slight dents and scratches. Well, it was to be expected. Wielding a sword with such force for a long period of time would cause consequences. He gave a slight sigh and looked up at the stars. Being a hollow didn't bother him in the least, but the girl's face didn't leave his head. Still, his thoughts came to remember his little sisters and his old man. This brought a melancholic smile to his face. The words he said to his mother echoed in his head. I'm so strong that I will protect them. His mood fell greatly when he remembered the words he said to his mother. What will I do now? He asked into the air as the silence of the place remained in the area. Sona was sorting some papers on her desk. Hours had passed since that conversation she had with him, and she simply couldn't get the orange-haired boy out of her head. She sighed and finished signing some documents regarding the organization of the infirmary's medications, as well as the cleaning of various classrooms. She was half closing her eyes, somewhat bored, almost falling asleep if it weren't for the fact that the same boy was behind her. Aren't you bored? He said, making the girl jump out of her seat at the sudden comment, taking her by surprise. How did you get in? She asked. Through the window, the boy said simply as he took the document that the girl had signed a moment ago. Oh? You work at a school, he said, observing what the document was about. He also observed the girl's perfect handwriting. Why did you come back? She said, not giving importance to what the boy had said before. It's not like you can't bring me here by force whenever you want, he said without looking at her, while he continued reading that document. So you've accepted it already? He said, trying to bother him again. The boy continued looking at the paper, paused, and continued, I no longer have anything else to continue. If you wish to kill me for your friends, that's fine. I just hope it's not in a painful way, he said absolutely neutrally. He thought about it for a long period of time, but he still couldn't find something to live for. His sisters, father, and the world he knew were no longer with him, so what exactly was he protecting? He simply resigned himself to whatever the black-haired girl wanted to do. It had been done to her just because of what he did to her friends. You see it as a way of punishing himself for what he had done to his little sisters. He thought that if the girl did not want to kill him and use him for atrocious acts, he would simply not object, seeing it from her perspective as a way to carry his guilt and impose the same punishment on himself. The girl was very surprised by the boy's words, kill him. She once thought about it, but since she saw him sane, she had stopped thinking about this. Despite everything, she still didn't know him well, and he seemed to care about the well-being of others. Seeing that he was completely sane, she wanted to find out about him. But he didn't understand some things. A moment ago he was annoyed with the idea of being his slave, and now he was accepting it. Something must have happened. She was looking for possibilities, but still thought they didn't fit for him to make that decision. He brought her out of her stupor when she saw him coming out the window again. Hey. Where are you going? She said, looking at him. Well, let's go find a place to sleep, he said, turning to look at her. He wanted to leave as soon as possible before she decided to send him to the basement. There's a room next to mine, you can take it, he said hurriedly, getting an indescribable look from the boy. Oh, all right, he said, getting out of the window and heading for the door. Before Ichigo left, he turned to her. I'm really sorry and thank you, he said, bowing his head once more before leaving and headed towards the room she had indicated. He didn't expect this act from the girl. Sona watched as he simply left that room and sighed, thinking about what the days would be like from now on. Chapter 16 Bittersweet. The hazel-eyed man's gaze was fixed on the ceiling where he now resided, his mind not thinking about anything in particular. The large bed he was in was incredibly comfortable, and the sunset briefly illuminated the room he was in. Yawning, he was really bored, he moved his head to the side of the room and could only stare at his Zanpakuto. Zangetsu. His master, the old Zangetsu, no longer heard his voice. And this shocked him, the only thing that accompanied him in the most difficult moments to instruct him and guide him to get up, was no longer there. In his inner world, skyscrapers with broken windows and a solemn grayish sky adorned the view. He even wanted to see that white Zangetsu again, he hoped to find tranquility in his twisted smile, but it wasn't there either. Understanding this, he came to his senses and ended up getting out of bed. The day had passed and now it was getting dark, in all this time Sona had not called him, she knew well that he was busy with the affairs of that academy, however she did not say anything and went about her business. Ichigo stood silently in that room staring into space, there wasn't even a purpose he had overall, however he could see a flash of blue out of the corner of his eye. Blood began to flow from his body once more, he fell to the ground, feeling the hot liquid spill onto the floor, his vision became incomprehensible as to what was happening, but he then looked ahead and placed a hand where he felt the pain. Pierced, his mind quickly caught on, part of his abdomen was pierced in the blink of an eye, but it didn't end there, as his head snapped up to look at his attacker, a cut appeared on the side of his cheek, and his left ear had been vaporized. Finally, her hazel eye met those silver eyes that denoted an incredible emptiness. He was about to stop and dodge, but the girl's pale fingers had pierced his skin, and his windpipe was dangerously held by the girl. The sound and pain were not at all pleasant for himself, who if it weren't for his regeneration would have died minutes ago. "Open it," Afa said threateningly as she squeezed it, not letting him breathe and watching as the boy's nose and mouth dripped a characteristic red liquid. "Things feel normal, I guess." Sona thought on her way home, taking several steps while her thoughts flooded her head with different ideas. She planned to have a tray of cookies with milk, read a book and go to sleep, her steps hitting the ground delicately as she walked. She didn't want to even think about that orange hair, but something was bothering her slightly. She took a breath and a vehicle approached, signaling her to go home. She had said goodbye to Tsubaki and Zenovia a few hours ago, when she had finished filling out some paperwork and had been in charge of reorganizing the medication documents in the nursing room. The violet in her eyes turned to the car door, opening it and taking up space in it. The driver said nothing and went about finishing his work, taking her home. Then the walk was silent to his house, maybe I should prepare to talk to him, hazel-eyed. Chapter 17 Silver Breath. The ground cracked due to the changes in gravity caused by the pressure exerted by the force of the Infinity Dragon against him with such indifference, it was no wonder he had to try to suck in as much air as he could, since little or nothing could reach his lungs. It was then that the dragon gave way a little in his grip to let him breathe, causing him to eventually fall to the ground as the epithelium of his tissues slowly rebuilt itself. The boy was still processing the word the dragon said. "I won't repeat it again." A dimming light appeared over her hand. Still with his throat under reconstruction, he tried to find another way out of the problem. With this in mind, he spun on his axis and shot out into the sky outside the mansion. Being in the open and feeling the wind hit his face, he directed his gaze towards the place from which he had moved, he blinked slightly, and in moments the orange-haired man's head found itself pinned to the ground, while the dragon's small hand exerted force on it. "Last warning," he said as he continued to press on the head. Ichigo saw no other way out than to obey the dragon's request, unless his head was crushed like a watermelon. "Fine, but get off me," he said, feeling her hand move away from his face, allowing him to breathe in peace. He moved his Zanpakuto horizontally, and you could see the nothingness separating. Every movement of the boy was recorded in the dragon's head in an attempt to observe how to repeat that procedure, but she still could not understand how he managed to separate a space that was restricted to her. There you go, this throat can only stay open for short periods of time, so Ichigo watched as the girl stopped paying attention to him the moment he opened said space. The mass tried to get closer, and the moment it raised its arm to enter, it once again encountered an impenetrable barrier that completely repelled it, as if it were looking back through a window. A few minutes passed, however Ichigo didn't know what to do since the same dragon didn't move. He planned for her to enter and thus close the portal, so she wouldn't leave and get rid of her. Ichigo approached to see what was happening to him, however when he was close enough he was grabbed by the arm. "Why does this have to happen to me?" the dragon said in a fit of hatred as she grabbed the orange-haired boy and threw him towards her throat without expecting him to let go so as not to fall into it. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he said to her while in a moment of carelessness and letting herself be carried away, she did not resist the boy snatching, being dragged with him into her throat. Ichigo fell backwards onto his Reishi platform so as not to continue falling while the dragon fell on her belly, making him spit out the air from his mouth. As the dense place began to take its toll on Ichigo, the dragon looked back at the orange-haired boy, now noticing something, in her head, she was beginning to form a theory that she herself would take as correct. Sona stood on the door of the mansion, somewhat puzzled and angry to see a hole in the window and debris scattered around the mansion's garden, and she could get an idea of what had happened, and that included that orange hair and the easy way in which she attracts trouble. She was starting to throw a tantrum in her head, however, when she arrived at the living room, she found a dinner that left her in shock. There it was. The Infinity Dragon in all its splendor, she was sitting on the back of a bruised Ichigo on the ground, who contained his wide eyes as a result of some contusion he had suffered. The heiress's eyes finally met those of the dragon, who were about to understand a strange conversation. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.